Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe, it really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. Tonight, we journey into the dark corners of America's national forests, where towering trees and winding trails became the hunting grounds for one of the most calculating predators in modern criminal history. This is the story of Gary Michael Hilton, known as the National Forest serial killer, and how his own arrogance and desperation ultimately led to his capture while literally cleaning evidence from his van. So, let me take you back to the winter of 2008, when a routine tip would unravel a web of violence that had terrorized hikers across 3 states. This is a story of how evil can hide behind the facade of an ordinary man, and how justice sometimes comes down to a single moment of carelessness. Gary Michael Hilton was born on November 22, 1946, into what appeared to be an unremarkable life. Growing up in the post-war American landscape, he seemed destined for mediocrity rather than infamy. But beneath the surface of this seemingly ordinary man, something far more sinister was taking shape. By the time he reached his 60s, Hilton had become a drifter, living out of his white Chevrolet Astro van, moving from one national forest to another. To those who encountered him on hiking trails, he appeared to be just another aging outdoor enthusiast, perhaps a bit eccentric, but harmless enough. He kept his graying hair neat, spoke politely to fellow hikers, and often traveled with his golden retriever, Dandy, a detail that would prove crucial to his predatory methods. The national forests of the southeastern United States became Hilton's domain. These vast wilderness areas, spanning hundreds of thousands of acres across Georgia, North Carolina, and Florida, offered him the perfect combination of isolation and opportunity. Here, among the ancient mountains and dense woodlands, hikers would venture alone or in small groups, trusting in the peace and solitude that nature promised. What they didn't know was that someone was watching them, studying their patterns, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Hilton had developed a sophisticated understanding of these forest systems over years of careful observation. He knew which trails were less traveled, which areas had poor cell phone reception, and most importantly, which spots would allow him to dispose of evidence without detection. The man who appeared to be a harmless nature lover was actually conducting reconnaissance, mapping out territories for future crimes. The forests that had always represented refuge and renewal for countless Americans had become something else entirely in Hilton's twisted worldview. They had become his private hunting preserve. The first known victims of Gary Hilton's calculated violence were John and Irene Bryant, an elderly couple who embodied everything beautiful about the hiking community. Jack Bryant, 80 years old, and his wife Irene, 84, were seasoned hikers who had spent decades exploring the trails of western North Carolina. They lived in Horseshoe, a small mountain community where neighbors looked out for each other and where the Bryants' gentle spirits had touched many lives. On October 21, 2007, the Bryants set out for what should have been another peaceful day on the trails near their home. They were experienced hikers who knew these mountains intimately, but even their decades of wilderness experience couldn't prepare them for what awaited them in the forest that day. When the couple failed to return home, their absence was noticed immediately. This wasn't like the Bryants. They were methodical people who followed schedules and communicated their plans. A search was launched, involving local law enforcement, park rangers, and volunteers from the tight-knit hiking community. Days passed with no sign of the missing couple. Search teams combed the forest trails, calling their names, hoping against hope to hear a response echoing through the trees. The autumn weather was growing colder, and with each passing hour, the chances of finding them alive seemed to diminish. Then, on November 6, 2007, hikers made a grisly discovery. Deep in the Pisgah National Forest, in an area that required considerable effort to reach, they found the bodies of John and Irene Bryant. The elderly couple had been brutally murdered, their lives ended not by accident or natural causes, but by deliberate violence. The crime scene told a horrific story. Both victims had suffered massive blunt force trauma to their heads. The killer had used what investigators would later determine was likely a tire iron or similar heavy implement, striking repeatedly with calculated brutality. This wasn't a crime of passion or a robbery gone wrong, it was execution, carried out with cold precision. But perhaps most chilling of all was what was missing from the scene. The couple's belongings had been systematically searched and certain items taken. Their vehicle was found miles away, abandoned and wiped clean of fingerprints. This level of planning and post-crime cleanup suggested something far more sinister than a random act of violence. Law enforcement officials realized they weren't dealing with an isolated incident. The methodical nature of the killings, the careful selection of victims in remote locations, and the systematic removal of evidence all pointed to one terrifying conclusion: a serial killer was stalking the national forests. As investigators began to piece together the evidence from the Bryant murders, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Hilton's method was as calculated as it was cruel, refined through careful observation and practice. He would position himself at popular hiking destinations, particularly those known for attracting solo hikers or small groups. His appearance, that of an aging but fit outdoorsman, coupled with his friendly golden retriever, Dandy, created the perfect camouflage. In the hiking community, dog owners often strike up conversations with other hikers, sharing trail information and enjoying the camaraderie that comes with a shared love of nature. Hilton exploited this trust ruthlessly. He would approach potential victims under the guise of being a fellow hiker, using Dandy as an icebreaker to lower their guard. The dog, innocent of his owner's intentions, became an unwitting accomplice in these encounters, his friendly demeanor helping to establish the normalcy that Hilton needed to get close to his targets. Once he had identified suitable victims, Hilton would follow them, sometimes for considerable distances, waiting for the perfect opportunity. He preferred isolated areas where cell phone service was unreliable or non-existent, locations where screams wouldn't carry to other hikers, places where he could work without interruption. His white Chevrolet Astro van served as both his mobile base of operations and his prison. The vehicle was equipped with restraints and other tools that revealed the premeditated nature of his crimes. This wasn't someone who killed in moments of uncontrolled rage, this was someone who had planned every aspect of his attacks, from the initial approach to the final disposal of evidence. After securing his victims, Hilton would typically drive them to even more remote locations, often crossing state lines to complicate any potential investigation. He would then extract information about their financial accounts, forcing them to provide ATM PIN numbers and other details that would allow him to access their money. But for Hilton, the financial gain seemed secondary to the control and power he exercised over his victims. The evidence suggested that he kept them alive for extended periods, not out of any mercy, but to maximize their suffering and his own sense of dominance. When he finally killed them, it was with the same tire iron or similar blunt instrument, delivering crushing blows to the head with methodical precision. He would then dispose of the bodies in carefully chosen locations, often removing identifying features to delay identification and complicate forensic analysis. As 2007 drew to a close, 24-year-old Meredith Hope Emerson was looking forward to the new year with the optimism that defined her character. A University of Georgia graduate, Meredith embodied the spirit of young people who find joy and renewal in nature. She was an avid hiker who loved exploring Georgia's mountain trails, often accompanied by her beloved chocolate Labrador, Ella. Meredith was the kind of person who made everyone around her feel valued and appreciated. Her friends described her as someone who could light up a room with her smile, who approached life with genuine enthusiasm and kindness. She worked as a personal trainer, helping others achieve their fitness goals, and she lived her own life as an example of health and vitality. On New Year's Day, 2008, Meredith decided to celebrate the beginning of the year by doing what she loved most, hiking in the mountains. She chose Blood Mountain, a popular destination in Georgia's Chattahoochee National Forest, known for its challenging trails and spectacular views. At 4,458 feet, Blood Mountain offered hikers a rewarding climb and, on clear days, panoramic vistas that stretched for miles. Meredith packed her hiking gear, leashed up Ella, and drove to the trailhead, planning to spend the day in the peaceful solitude of the mountains. She had hiked these trails many times before and felt comfortable navigating them alone. For someone like Meredith, who found spiritual renewal in nature, there was no better way to start the new year. What she didn't know was that Gary Hilton had been watching the parking area at Blood Mountain, studying the patterns of hikers, identifying potential targets. When he saw a young woman hiking alone with her dog, he saw an opportunity. Hilton, with his own dog Dandy by his side, approached Meredith on the trail. To other hikers who might have seen the encounter, it would have looked perfectly normal, two dog owners meeting on a mountain path, their pets playing together while their humans exchanged pleasantries about trail conditions and hiking plans. But this wasn't a chance encounter. Hilton had been planning this moment, waiting for exactly this type of opportunity. Using his well-practiced routine, he gained Meredith's trust, probably offering helpful information about the trails or commenting on their dog's friendship. At some point during their interaction, the situation turned violent. Whether Hilton produced a weapon immediately or managed to lure Meredith to a more isolated location before revealing his true intentions, the result was the same: a vibrant young woman full of hope and promise found herself in the hands of a predator. What followed was a nightmare that stretched across 3 agonizing days. Hilton forced Meredith into his van, beginning a period of captivity that would test every ounce of her strength and courage. Unlike his previous victims, who had been killed relatively quickly, Meredith would endure an extended ordeal that revealed both the depths of Hilton's cruelty and the extraordinary resilience of the human spirit. During those 3 days, Hilton drove Meredith to various locations, keeping her restrained in his van while he extracted information about her financial accounts. He forced her to provide her ATM PIN number and other banking details, using her cards to withdraw cash from various machines across North Georgia. But Meredith wasn't a passive victim. Even in the face of unimaginable terror, she fought back with remarkable courage and intelligence. She attempted to escape multiple times, at one point managing to partially free herself from her restraints. When escape seemed impossible, she tried to leave clues that might help investigators find her, subtly dropping small items that might serve as breadcrumbs for searchers. Throughout her ordeal, Meredith's dog Ella remained with her in the van, providing whatever comfort a loyal companion could offer in such circumstances. The bond between them, forged through countless hikes and shared adventures, now became a source of strength in her darkest hours. Hilton later claimed that Meredith was difficult during her captivity, a statement that investigators interpreted as evidence of her continued resistance even in the face of overwhelming odds. She refused to submit quietly to her fate, fighting for her life with every breath. Meanwhile, Meredith's absence had been noticed by friends and family. When she failed to return from her New Year's Day hike, those who loved her knew immediately that something was wrong. Meredith was responsible and communicative; she wouldn't simply disappear without explanation. A massive search effort was launched, involving law enforcement agencies, park rangers, and hundreds of volunteers. Helicopters swept the mountains while ground teams combed every trail and ravine. The hiking community, which had already been shaken by the Bryant murders just months earlier, rallied with unprecedented determination to find one of their own. As the hours turned into days, the search expanded beyond Georgia's borders. Investigators began to suspect that they might be dealing with the same person responsible for the Bryant killings. The similarities were too striking to ignore: another hiker targeted in a national forest, another carefully planned abduction, another case where the perpetrator seemed to have extensive knowledge of wilderness areas. But unlike the Bryant case, this time they had something they hadn't had before: time. Meredith was still alive somewhere, and every hour that passed was an hour that might yield crucial evidence or witness testimony that could lead to her rescue. As the search for Meredith Emerson entered its fourth day, investigators were building a clearer picture of what had happened. Security cameras at various ATM locations had captured images of someone using Meredith's bank cards, providing crucial visual evidence of the perpetrator. The man in the surveillance footage matched descriptions of someone who had been seen in the area of Blood Mountain around the time of Meredith's disappearance. Several witnesses came forward with reports of a white van and an older man with a golden retriever who had been in the area on New Year's Day. Law enforcement agencies coordinated their efforts across multiple jurisdictions, sharing information and resources in real time. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit was consulted, providing insights into the likely patterns and preferences of someone who would commit such crimes in national forest settings. One crucial break came from analyzing the ATM transactions. The pattern of withdrawal suggested that the perpetrator was moving in a roughly circular route through North Georgia, staying within a relatively confined geographic area. This suggested local knowledge, someone familiar with the back roads and hidden areas of the region. But perhaps most importantly, investigators realized they were dealing with someone who had probably done this before. The level of planning and execution visible in both the Bryant murders and Meredith's abduction pointed to an experienced predator, someone who had refined his methods through practice. On January 4, 2008, the investigation reached a critical turning point. A witness called police to report suspicious activity at a grocery store in Cumming, Georgia. Someone was seen aggressively cleaning out a white van in the parking lot, using what appeared to be bleach or other cleaning supplies to scrub the interior. The witness, whose name would not be released to protect their safety, described seeing a man who appeared nervous and was working frantically to clean bloodstains from inside the vehicle. The man matched the description of the suspect seen in the ATM surveillance footage, and the van matched the vehicle description that had been circulated to law enforcement agencies. Police responded immediately to the call, racing to the location with the desperate hope that they might finally have found their suspect. As they arrived at the scene, they could see a man bent over the interior of a white Chevrolet Astro van, scrubbing furiously at dark stains on the upholstery. It was Gary Michael Hilton, and he was literally in the act of trying to destroy evidence of his crimes. The arrest of Gary Hilton unfolded with dramatic swiftness, but not before investigators had a heart-stopping moment when they realized how close they had come to losing crucial evidence forever. When officers arrived at the Cumming grocery store parking lot, they found Hilton with bottles of bleach and cleaning supplies spread around his van. The interior of the vehicle showed clear signs of recent and intensive cleaning efforts, but fortunately for the investigation, Hilton had not been thorough enough in his attempts to destroy evidence. Crime scene analysts would later determine that the timing of the arrest was crucial. Had Hilton been given another hour or two to complete his cleaning efforts, he might have succeeded in destroying DNA evidence that would prove vital to the prosecution. As it was, investigators were able to recover significant blood evidence from areas of the van that Hilton hadn't yet reached with his bleach. The arrest itself was anticlimactic in its brevity. Faced with multiple police officers and caught in the act of evidence destruction, Hilton offered no resistance. One officer later described him as looking guilty as sin, the expression of a man who knew his crimes had finally caught up with him. Inside the van, investigators made discoveries that painted a horrifying picture of what Meredith Emerson had endured during her captivity. Blood evidence was found throughout the interior, along with restraints and other items that clearly indicated the vehicle had been used to hold someone against their will. But perhaps most heartbreaking of all, searchers found items that belonged to Meredith, personal effects that she had carried with her on that New Year's Day hike that had begun with such hope and promise. Among the evidence recovered was Meredith's driver's license, hiking gear, and other personal belongings. The presence of these items in Hilton's van provided ironclad proof of his involvement in her disappearance, but investigators still faced the agonizing question of whether she was still alive. As Hilton was processed at the police station, investigators worked frantically to analyze the evidence and build a timeline of his movements over the previous 4 days. They were racing against time, knowing that if Meredith was still alive, every moment of delay could be the difference between rescue and tragedy. The blood evidence found in the van was rushed to crime laboratories for DNA analysis, while investigators began the painstaking process of matching the evidence to witness statements and surveillance footage from ATM locations across North Georgia. Meanwhile, search teams continued to comb the forests and mountains, looking for any sign of where Hilton might have taken Meredith. The fact that he had been caught cleaning his van suggested that whatever had happened to her had already occurred, but investigators refused to give up hope until they had definitive proof. With Gary Hilton in custody and evidence mounting against him, investigators faced a terrible dilemma. They had enough evidence to charge him with Meredith Emerson's kidnapping and likely murder, but they still didn't know where she was or whether she might somehow still be alive. Hilton, now represented by legal counsel, understood the gravity of his situation. The evidence against him was overwhelming: DNA evidence, surveillance footage, witness testimony, and his own suspicious behavior all pointed to his guilt. But he held one crucial piece of information that investigators desperately needed: the location of Meredith's body. Prosecutors faced an agonizing decision. They could proceed with the case based on the evidence they had, seeking the death penalty for what appeared to be a premeditated murder. But doing so might mean that Meredith's family would never have closure, never know what had happened to their daughter in her final moments, never be able to lay her to rest with dignity. Alternatively, they could negotiate with Hilton, offering him a deal that would spare his life in exchange for information about Meredith's location and details about what had happened during those 3 terrible days. The decision ultimately came down to what would serve justice best, and what would provide some measure of peace to a family destroyed by grief and uncertainty. After extensive consultation with Meredith's family, prosecutors made the difficult decision to negotiate with Hilton. In exchange for revealing the location of Meredith's body and providing details about her death, he would be allowed to plead guilty to murder and receive a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, avoiding the death penalty. It was, as one investigator later described it, a deal with the devil, but it was the only way to ensure that Meredith's family would have answers and that she could be brought home for proper burial. On January 7, 2008, exactly 1 week after Meredith had set out for her New Year's Day hike, Hilton led investigators to a remote area of Dawson Forest, about 60 miles northeast of Atlanta. There, hidden in dense woodland far from any hiking trail, they found her remains. The discovery confirmed investigators' worst fears. Meredith had been brutally murdered, killed with the same type of blunt force trauma that had ended the lives of John and Irene Bryant. But in a final act of cruelty that revealed the depths of Hilton's depravity, he had decapitated her after death, claiming it was for forensic purposes, to make identification more difficult. With Meredith Emerson's murder resolved through Hilton's confession and guilty plea, investigators turned their attention to the broader scope of his crimes. The methodical nature of his attacks and his extensive knowledge of wilderness areas suggested that there might be other victims, other families who deserved answers about their missing loved ones. The evidence linking Hilton to the Bryant murders in North Carolina was substantial, built on witness testimony, forensic evidence, and his own admissions during questioning. Like the Emerson case, this would result in a guilty plea and life sentence, as prosecutors in North Carolina also chose certainty over the uncertainty of a death penalty trial. But investigators suspected that Hilton's killing spree extended beyond these known cases. His pattern of targeting hikers in national forests, combined with his years of drifting from state to state, suggested that there might be unsolved disappearances in other jurisdictions that could be connected to his activities. One case that drew particular attention was the murder of Cheryl Hodges Dunlap in Florida's Apalachicola National Forest. Dunlap, a nurse and Sunday school teacher, had disappeared while hiking in December 2007, around the same time that Hilton was known to be in the area. Her body was found several days later, and the circumstances of her death bore striking similarities to Hilton's other known crimes. Unlike the cases in Georgia and North Carolina, Florida prosecutors decided to pursue the death penalty against Hilton for Dunlap's murder. The trial provided additional insights into his methods and mindset, painting a picture of a man who viewed other human beings as nothing more than objects to be exploited and discarded. During the Florida proceedings, evidence emerged that Hilton had been living as a drifter for years, supporting himself through small-time scams and petty crimes while gradually escalating to more serious offenses. His van wasn't just a vehicle, it was his entire world, equipped with everything he needed to live independently while hunting for victims in America's wilderness areas. The psychological evaluation conducted as part of the Florida case revealed a man who showed no genuine remorse for his actions, who viewed his victims' suffering as irrelevant to his own needs and desires. He was, in the clinical language of forensic psychology, a textbook psychopath, someone entirely lacking in empathy or normal human emotion. Hilton was ultimately convicted of Cheryl Dunlap's murder and sentenced to death, though he remains on death row in Florida as of this recording, his case still working its way through the lengthy appeals process that characterizes capital punishment cases. As the legal proceedings against Gary Hilton moved through the courts, the families and friends of his victims worked to ensure that their loved ones would be remembered not as statistics in a criminal case, but as the vibrant, beloved people they had been in life. John and Irene Bryant, the elderly couple who had spent decades sharing their love of hiking with others, were remembered through a memorial fund that supported trail maintenance and safety education in the North Carolina mountains they had loved. Their friends spoke of their kindness, their generosity with younger hikers who sought their advice, and their enduring love for each other that had lasted through more than 50 years of marriage. Meredith Emerson's memory was honored in multiple ways that reflected the different aspects of her life. A scholarship fund was established at the University of Georgia to support students studying outdoor recreation and environmental science. Hiking groups across the Southeast organized memorial hikes in her honor, celebrating her love of nature while raising awareness about trail safety. Perhaps most importantly, Meredith's story became a catalyst for improved safety measures and communication systems in wilderness areas. The Meredith's Message safety campaign taught hikers about the importance of letting others know their plans, carrying emergency communication devices, and staying alert to potential dangers on the trails. Cheryl Dunlap was remembered by her nursing colleagues and the members of her church as someone who dedicated her life to caring for others. The contrast between her selfless devotion to helping people and the senseless violence that ended her life served as a powerful reminder of how random evil can intersect with good. These three individuals, John and Irene Bryant and Meredith Emerson and Cheryl Dunlap, represented everything good about the hiking community: their love of nature, their trust in fellow outdoor enthusiasts, their willingness to explore and take reasonable risks in pursuit of beauty and adventure. Hilton's crimes didn't just end their lives, they shattered the fundamental trust that makes wilderness recreation possible. The case of Gary Hilton serves as a sobering reminder that evil can hide behind the most ordinary facades. To fellow hikers who encountered him on the trails, he appeared to be nothing more than an aging outdoor enthusiast with his friendly dog. There were no obvious warning signs, no clear indicators that he was anything other than what he appeared to be. This reality forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about safety in wilderness areas. The very qualities that make hiking and outdoor recreation so appealing, the solitude, the escape from urban vigilance, the trust in fellow nature lovers, can also create vulnerabilities that predators like Hilton are prepared to exploit. But the solution isn't to abandon the wilderness or to approach every fellow hiker with suspicion. Instead, Hilton's crimes highlight the importance of reasonable precautions that can significantly reduce risk without destroying the joy of outdoor exploration. Modern technology offers tools that weren't available to Hilton's victims. GPS devices, satellite messengers, and cell phone apps can maintain communication with the outside world even in remote areas. These tools don't guarantee safety, but they provide crucial backup when things go wrong. The hiking community's response to these tragedies also demonstrates the power of collective action. Trail organizations, park services, and outdoor recreation groups work together to improve safety education, enhance communication systems, and create support networks that make solo hiking safer without discouraging it entirely. Perhaps most importantly, the investigation and prosecution of Hilton showed how effective law enforcement can be when agencies coordinate their efforts and share information across jurisdictional boundaries. The speed with which investigators connected the various crimes and built a comprehensive case against Hilton prevented additional tragedies and brought swift justice to the families of his victims. The successful prosecution of Gary Hilton represented more than just justice for his known victims. It marked a significant advancement in how law enforcement agencies handle serial crimes that cross state and jurisdictional boundaries. The investigation demonstrated the crucial importance of rapid information sharing between agencies. When the Bryant murders occurred in North Carolina, followed by Meredith Emerson's disappearance in Georgia, investigators were able to quickly identify similarities and coordinate their efforts. This coordination was essential to building the comprehensive case that ultimately led to Hilton's capture. The role of technology in the investigation cannot be overstated. ATM surveillance cameras provided crucial visual evidence that helped establish Hilton's movements and timeline. DNA analysis linked him definitively to the crime scenes. Cell phone records helped map his activities across multiple states. But perhaps most importantly, the case highlighted the value of public awareness and community involvement. The witness who reported Hilton's suspicious behavior while cleaning his van made the phone call that led directly to his arrest. Without that citizen's vigilance and willingness to get involved, Hilton might have succeeded in destroying crucial evidence. The investigation also revealed gaps in communication systems that have since been addressed. The relatively isolated nature of many hiking areas means that cell phone coverage remains spotty, but improvements in satellite communication technology have made emergency communication more reliable for wilderness travelers. Trail safety education programs developed in response to these crimes have become standard throughout the national forest system. Rangers now regularly conduct presentations about personal safety, emergency preparedness, and risk assessment for wilderness travel. The psychological profile developed during Hilton's prosecution has been used to train law enforcement officers in recognizing patterns that might indicate serial predation in wilderness areas. The specific combination of mobility, local knowledge, and predatory behavior that characterized Hilton's crime serves as a template for identifying similar threats. For the families and friends of Gary Hilton's victims, the conclusion of his trials marked not an ending, but a transition to a different kind of struggle, learning to live with loss while honoring the memory of those they had loved. Meredith Emerson's parents, Dave and Peggy Emerson, became advocates for hiking safety, working with organizations across the country to promote awareness and prevention programs. Their willingness to channel their grief into action that might protect others demonstrated remarkable strength and generosity of spirit. The Emerson family also worked to ensure that Meredith's dog, Ella, who had survived the ordeal and was found wandering in a parking lot after Hilton's arrest, received the care and love she needed. Ella became a living connection to Meredith, a reminder of the joy and companionship that had characterized their relationship. Friends and family of John and Irene Bryant established annual memorial hikes that celebrate the couple's love of the mountains while raising funds for trail maintenance and safety improvements. These events bring together hikers from across the region, creating a community of remembrance that ensures the Bryants' legacy continues. The broader hiking community also underwent changes in response to these tragedies. What had once been an activity characterized by spontaneity and casual planning became more systematized, with greater emphasis on communication protocols, emergency preparedness, and situational awareness. Hiking groups began implementing buddy systems and check-in procedures that provided additional safety nets for their members. Online forums and social media platforms developed systems for sharing trail conditions and safety alerts in real time. Equipment manufacturers responded with new products designed to enhance safety for solo hikers. Personal locator beacons became more affordable and user-friendly. Smartphone apps were developed that could send automatic alerts if a hiker failed to check in at predetermined times. Gary Hilton's life behind bars offers little in the way of redemption or reflection. Interviews with prison officials and psychological evaluators paint a picture of a man who remains largely unchanged by his experiences, showing no genuine remorse for his actions and no real understanding of the pain he has caused. In Georgia, where he is serving a life sentence for Meredith Emerson's murder, Hilton has been classified as a high-security prisoner, kept separate from the general population due to the nature of his crimes and concerns about his safety. Prison records indicate that he has had minimal disciplinary problems, following institutional rules with the same calculated compliance that characterized his approach to avoiding detection while committing his crimes. Psychological evaluations conducted during his incarceration have consistently found him to be manipulative and self-serving, willing to provide information only when it serves his own interests. He has shown no interest in participating in rehabilitation programs or counseling services, maintaining the same emotional detachment that enabled him to commit murder without apparent guilt or remorse. In Florida, where he remains on death row for the murder of Cheryl Dunlap, Hilton has filed the standard appeals that characterize capital cases, challenging various aspects of his trial and conviction. These legal proceedings continue to move through the courts, though most legal observers believe it is unlikely that his conviction will be overturned. The appeals process has provided additional insights into Hilton's background and psychology. Court documents reveal a history of failed relationships, financial instability, and increasing social isolation that may have contributed to his evolution into a serial killer. However, mental health experts emphasize that these factors, while relevant to understanding his development, do not excuse or mitigate the horror of his crimes. Prison staff report that Hilton spends most of his time reading and watching television, showing particular interest in news coverage of other criminal cases. This pattern of behavior is consistent with the narcissistic personality traits that many serial killers display, maintaining a self-centered focus even in confinement. Even with Gary Hilton behind bars and his known crimes resolved through conviction and sentencing, troubling questions remain about the full scope of his activities and the possibility of additional victims whose cases have never been solved. Law enforcement agencies across the Southeast continue to review cold cases involving missing hikers and unexplained deaths in wilderness areas, looking for patterns that might connect to Hilton's known methods and timeline. His years of drifting from state to state, combined with his extensive knowledge of national forest systems, suggest that there may be other crimes that have not yet been linked to him. The challenge facing investigators is that many wilderness areas have limited surveillance systems and sparse populations, making it difficult to reconstruct events that may have occurred years ago. Additionally, some disappearances in national forests are never fully investigated as homicides, being classified instead as accidents or voluntary disappearances. One case that continues to generate speculation is the 1997 disappearance of Judy Smith, a nurse from Massachusetts who vanished while visiting Virginia. Smith's remains were found months later in a remote area of Shenandoah National Park, but her death was never definitively classified as a homicide. Some investigators believe the circumstances of her disappearance and the location where her body was found are consistent with Hilton's known methods, though no definitive evidence has been found to support this theory. The difficulty of investigating these potential connections highlights broader challenges in tracking crimes that occur across multiple jurisdictions and in remote locations. While improvements in database systems and interagency communication have made such investigations more effective, the basic challenge remains. Serial offenders who target victims in isolated areas can operate for extended periods before being detected. Hilton's case also raises questions about the effectiveness of background check systems and monitoring of individuals who live transient lifestyles. While he had previous arrests for minor offenses, nothing in his criminal history would have predicted his escalation to serial murder. This reality underscores the limitations of prediction and prevention when dealing with individuals who are capable of hiding their true nature for extended periods. As we reach the end of this story, it's important to remember that true crime narratives like this one serve multiple purposes. They satisfy our curiosity about the darker aspects of human nature, but they also serve as memorials to victims whose lives were cut short by senseless violence. John and Irene Bryant, Meredith Emerson, and Cheryl Dunlap were not just names in news reports or statistics in criminal databases. They were people who brought joy and meaning to the lives of those who knew them. They were individuals who found peace and renewal in nature, who trusted in the fundamental goodness of fellow human beings, and who paid the ultimate price for that trust. The forests and mountains where these crimes occurred continue to welcome millions of visitors each year. The trails that witnessed such horror also provide countless moments of beauty, peace, and spiritual renewal for those who walk them. In this way, the legacy of Hilton's victims lives on, not in the fear and suspicion that his crimes might have created, but in the continued appreciation for wilderness that they embodied in their lives. The investigation that brought Gary Hilton to justice represents law enforcement at its finest, multiple agencies working together, sharing information and resources, refusing to give up even when the trail seemed cold. The citizen who made that crucial phone call about suspicious activity in a parking lot demonstrated the power of community vigilance and civic responsibility. But perhaps most importantly, this case reminds us that evil, while real and sometimes devastating in its impact, ultimately fails in its attempt to destroy the human spirit. The families of Hilton's victims could have been consumed by bitterness and despair. Instead, they chose to channel their grief into positive action that might protect others and honor the memory of those they lost. The safety improvements, education programs, and enhanced communication systems that emerged from this tragedy have undoubtedly saved lives. Trail maintenance funds established in memory of John and Irene Bryant continue to make hiking safer for thousands of people. Meredith's message continues to educate hikers about personal safety. Cheryl Dunlap's memory inspires others to live with the same compassion and dedication to helping others that characterized her life. In the end, Gary Hilton succeeded only in revealing his own moral bankruptcy. His victims, by contrast, continue to inspire others through their example of how to live fully, love deeply, and find joy in the natural world that surrounds us. The mountains and forests remain, eternal and beautiful, offering solace and adventure to those brave enough to seek them. The trails continue to beckon, promising discovery and renewal to those who walk them with appropriate caution and preparation. And somewhere in the whisper of wind through ancient trees, in the play of sunlight on mountain streams, in the quiet satisfaction of reaching a summit after a challenging climb, the spirits of those who were taken too soon continue to remind us why these wild places matter, why they must be protected, and why the human desire to explore and commune with nature will always triumph over those who would corrupt it with violence and hatred. Please, if you're new here, welcome to the channel, where we explore true crime stories in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, we'll explore a heartbreaking case that shook the city of Bradford in April 2024. This is the story of Kulsuma Akhtar, a young mother who paid the ultimate price for seeking freedom from an abusive marriage. Her story serves as a sobering reminder of the dangers faced by women trying to escape domestic violence, and the tragic consequences when the system fails to protect those most vulnerable. So, let me tell you about Kulsuma's story, a tale of courage, fear, love for her child, and ultimately, a life cut tragically short. Kulsuma Akhtar was just 27 years old in the spring of 2024. Originally from Bangladesh, she had built a life in Oldham, Greater Manchester, where she lived with dreams of raising her young son in safety and peace. Kulsuma was a devoted mother to her 7-month-old baby boy, a child who represented hope and a future she was determined to protect. Those who knew Kulsuma described her as a gentle soul, someone who found joy in the simple pleasures of motherhood. She would spend hours caring for her infant son, pushing his pram through quiet streets, speaking to him softly in Bengali, telling him stories of the life she hoped to build for them both. The baby, with his curious eyes and innocent smile, was the center of her world, a beacon of light in what had become an increasingly dark chapter of her life. But behind the facade of domestic tranquility lay a troubling reality. Kulsuma's marriage to Habibur Mansoor had become a source of fear rather than comfort. What had perhaps once been a partnership filled with hope had deteriorated into something much more sinister. The man who should have been her protector had become her greatest threat. Habibur Mansoor was 26 years old, just a year younger than Kulsuma. To the outside world, he might have appeared to be an ordinary young man. He even had a presence on social media, presenting himself as a YouTuber, someone who crafted an online persona that bore little resemblance to the reality of who he was behind closed doors. This disconnect between public image and private behavior is often seen in cases of domestic abuse, where perpetrators maintain carefully constructed facades while inflicting terror on their victims in private. The couple's relationship had begun to show cracks that would eventually become chasms. What started as controlling behavior had escalated into something far more dangerous. Mansoor's need to dominate every aspect of Kulsuma's life had grown into an obsession that would prove deadly. As 2023 drew to a close, the situation in their household had become untenable. The walls of their home had witnessed arguments that escalated beyond words, moments of violence that left Kulsuma living in constant fear. But it was her baby that gave her the strength to consider what had once seemed impossible, leaving. November 2023 would prove to be a pivotal month in this tragic story. It was during this time that the simmering tensions in the Mansoor household finally boiled over into violence that could no longer be hidden or explained away. On November 23, 2023, an incident occurred that would be documented by police and later presented in court. According to legal records, this was the day that Habibur Mansoor physically assaulted his wife. The details of this assault, while part of the official record, paint a picture of a man whose control over his wife had escalated to physical violence. But the terror didn't end there. The very next day, November 24, Mansoor crossed another line entirely. This was the day he made threats to kill Kulsuma, threats that were serious enough to later form part of criminal charges against him. These weren't empty words spoken in the heat of an argument, they were calculated threats designed to instill fear and maintain control. For Kulsuma, hearing those words must have been a moment of devastating clarity. The man who had promised to love and protect her was now threatening to take her life. The father of her child had become the person she most feared. In that moment, she must have realized that her very survival, and that of her baby, depended on getting away. The psychological impact of such threats cannot be overstated. Kulsuma was not just dealing with the immediate fear for her physical safety, she was grappling with the complete destruction of trust, the shattering of whatever remained of her marriage, and the terrifying realization that the person who knew her most intimately was also the person most likely to harm her. What makes this even more chilling is Mansoor's later claims about these incidents. During his eventual trial, he would deny that any violence had occurred. He would tell investigators that Kulsuma had fabricated the entire domestic violence case against him, suggesting that she was using false allegations as a way to remain in the United Kingdom while he wanted to return to Bangladesh. This denial is unfortunately common in domestic violence cases. Perpetrators often minimize their actions, shift blame to their victims, or deny that abuse occurred at all. For someone in Kulsuma's position, this gaslighting would have been yet another form of psychological abuse, being told that her own experiences weren't real, that her fear was unfounded, that she was the problem. But Kulsuma knew the truth of what she had experienced. The bruises might heal, but the memory of those threats would remain fresh. She understood that she was living with someone capable of carrying out those threats, and that realization would drive her to make the most difficult decision of her life. By January 2024, Kulsuma had made a decision that would require tremendous courage. She would leave her husband and seek safety for herself and her baby. This decision, while necessary for her survival, would set in motion a series of events that would ultimately lead to tragedy. Leaving an abusive relationship is never simple, and for someone in Kulsuma's situation, it was particularly complex. She wasn't just leaving a marriage, she was leaving behind a way of life, a home, and stepping into an uncertain future with a 7-month-old baby depending entirely on her. Kulsuma found refuge in a women's shelter, a safe house designed specifically for women fleeing domestic violence. These facilities serve as lifelines for women in desperate situations, providing not just physical shelter but also support services, counseling, and assistance with legal matters. For Kulsuma, this refuge represented hope, a chance to rebuild her life away from fear. Living in a refuge meant adapting to a completely new routine. Gone were the familiar surroundings of her own home, replaced by shared spaces and the constant awareness that she was there because her life had been in danger. But it also meant safety, or at least, the promise of safety. It meant her baby could sleep peacefully without the threat of violence in the next room. During her time at the refuge, Kulsuma would have been working with support workers, possibly attending counseling sessions, and beginning the long process of rebuilding her sense of self-worth and autonomy. These facilities don't just provide temporary housing, they help women develop safety plans, understand their legal options, and begin to envision a future free from abuse. But Habibur Mansour was not content to let his wife disappear into safety. Despite the physical distance between them, he continued his campaign of harassment and intimidation. Modern technology, which can be a tool for connection and communication, became another weapon in his arsenal of control. The most chilling evidence of his continued obsession came in the form of a photograph. While Kulsuma was living at the refuge, believing herself to be safe and hidden from her abuser, Mansour managed to locate the facility. He sent her a photograph of the front of the building, a message that was crystal clear in its intent: "I know where you are." This single image represented a complete violation of the safety that the refuge was supposed to provide. It told Kulsuma that no matter how far she ran, no matter what precautions she took, he could still find her. The psychological impact of receiving such a message cannot be overstated. It transforms what should have been a place of healing into a place of renewed fear. The fact that he had not only located the refuge but had taken the time to photograph it and send it to her suggests a level of premeditation and obsession that was deeply disturbing. This wasn't a momentary lapse in judgment, it was evidence of sustained stalking behavior. For the staff at the refuge, this would have been equally concerning. The security of their facility had been compromised, and one of their residents was being directly threatened. They would have had to reassess their safety protocols and possibly consider relocating Kulsuma to ensure her continued protection. But life in hiding is not sustainable indefinitely. Eventually, practical necessities require venturing outside the walls of safety. Shopping for basic supplies, medical appointments, legal meetings, all of these normal activities become fraught with danger when you're being stalked by someone who has already threatened your life. Saturday, April 6, 2024, began like many others for Kulsuma. It was a pleasant spring day in Bradford, West Yorkshire. The weather was mild, and people were out enjoying the weekend, going about their normal routines, shopping, meeting friends, enjoying the simple pleasures of a Saturday afternoon in the city centre. For Kulsuma, this was meant to be an ordinary outing. She had made the journey from her refuge to Bradford city centre, likely for shopping or to meet with support services. With her 7-month-old baby securely fastened in his pram, she was accompanied by a friend, someone who provided not just companionship but an additional sense of security. The baby, now 7 months old, had grown considerably since those frightening November days. He was at an age where he was becoming more aware of his surroundings, possibly beginning to recognize faces and respond to his mother's voice with coos and smiles. For Kulsuma, these small milestones would have been precious moments of normalcy amid the chaos her life had become. Bradford city centre on a Saturday afternoon was bustling with activity. Westgate, one of the main shopping streets, was filled with families, teenagers, elderly couples, and individuals going about their weekend errands. Street vendors might have been calling out their wares, the sounds of traffic mixing with conversations and laughter. It was the kind of environment where a young mother pushing a pram would blend seamlessly into the crowd. Kulsuma and her friend were likely moving at the relaxed pace that comes with pushing a pram, perhaps stopping to look in shop windows or pausing to adjust the baby's blanket. These were the simple, unremarkable moments that make up the fabric of daily life, moments that should have been safe and ordinary. But unbeknownst to Kulsuma, she was being watched. Habiba Mansour had somehow tracked her movements to Bradford. Whether through surveillance, monitoring her communications, or simply by knowing her routines well enough to predict where she might go, he had located her once again. The fact that he had traveled from his residence in Burnley, Lancashire, to Bradford suggests this was not a chance encounter. Burnley is approximately 30 miles from Bradford, far enough that his presence there required planning and intention. He would have had to make a deliberate decision to travel there, possibly spending time searching for her before locating her on Westgate. As the afternoon progressed toward 3:21 p.m., Kulsuma was walking near the junction of Westgate and Drewton Road. This intersection, in the heart of Bradford's shopping district, would have been busy with pedestrian traffic. People were around, witnesses to what was about to unfold, though none could have predicted the horror that was approaching. The baby in the pram was likely content, perhaps looking up at his mother or watching the world go by with the innocent curiosity of an infant. Kulsuma's friend was there beside her, providing the companionship that made these outings feel safer and more normal. But somewhere in that crowd, moving with deadly purpose, was Habiba Mansour. The man who had once promised to love and protect Kulsuma was now stalking her through the streets of Bradford, carrying with him the means to carry out the threats he had made months earlier. The attack, when it came, was swift, brutal, and utterly devastating. At exactly 3:21 p.m. on that Saturday afternoon, in broad daylight on a busy street in Bradford city centre, Habiba Mansour carried out the threats he had made to his wife months earlier. The weapon he had brought was a knife, a bladed article that transformed an ordinary object into an instrument of death. The fact that he was carrying this weapon is evidence of premeditation. This was not a crime of passion or a momentary loss of control, this was a planned execution. What happened next was described by prosecutors as a sustained and excessively violent attack. These clinical words, spoken in the formal language of the courtroom, barely capture the horror of those moments. Kulsuma was stabbed at least 25 times, a number that speaks to the frenzied nature of the assault and the level of rage that drove it. 25 stab wounds. Each one was a deliberate act of violence. Each one was an attempt to extinguish the life of a young mother who had done nothing more than try to protect herself and her child from abuse. The attack was so sustained and so vicious that it could only be described as an execution carried out in public. As this nightmare unfolded, Kulsuma fought for her life. Court records indicate that she suffered mentally and physically before her death as she tried to protect herself. Even in those final, terrifying moments, her instinct was to survive, to fight back, to try to return to her baby boy who needed her. The baby, secured in his pram, was physically unharmed during the attack. This detail is both a blessing and a tragedy, a blessing because an innocent child was spared physical harm, but a tragedy because he will grow up without his mother, his last memories of her being formed in those violent moments he was too young to understand. Witnesses to the attack were traumatized by what they saw. This was not something that happened in a dark alley or an isolated location, this was broad daylight violence in the heart of a busy shopping district. People going about their normal Saturday routines suddenly found themselves witnessing a murder. The psychological impact on these bystanders, some of whom may have had children with them, cannot be understated. Emergency services were called immediately. Within minutes, paramedics, police officers, and other first responders were on the scene. They found Kulsuma with injuries so severe that despite their best efforts, despite the speed of their response, there was little they could do. Kulsuma was rushed to hospital, where medical professionals worked desperately to save her life. But the wounds inflicted by her husband were too severe, the damage too extensive. Despite the skill and dedication of the medical team, Kulsuma Akhtar died from her injuries that day. Her baby, now orphaned by his father's actions, was unharmed physically but had lost the one person who had fought so hard to protect him. The friend who had accompanied Kulsuma was likely traumatized beyond measure, having witnessed the brutal murder of someone she cared about. As news of the attack spread, the community was shocked. Bradford, like any city, had its share of crime, but this level of violence, carried out so publicly and against such a vulnerable victim, sent shockwaves through the area. In the immediate aftermath of Kulsuma's murder, Habibur Mansour fled the scene. Having just committed one of the most heinous crimes imaginable, he disappeared into the crowd, beginning what would become a 4-day manhunt that gripped the region. The investigation began immediately. West Yorkshire Police, working in coordination with Greater Manchester Police, launched a comprehensive search operation. Crime scene investigators cordoned off the area where the attack had taken place, collecting evidence that would later be crucial in securing a conviction. The scene on Westgate told a story of unimaginable violence. Blood evidence, witness statements, and CCTV footage from the busy shopping district all contributed to building a picture of what had happened. The knife used in the attack was recovered, providing forensic evidence that would link Mansour to the crime. Meanwhile, the search for the perpetrator intensified. Police knew they were looking for an extremely dangerous individual, someone who had just demonstrated he was capable of the most extreme violence, even in broad daylight with witnesses present. Public safety was a paramount concern, as was the need to bring him to justice quickly. The manhunt involved multiple police forces and utilized various investigative techniques. Officers would have been reviewing CCTV footage from across the region, tracking possible escape routes, and coordinating with transport authorities to monitor bus and train stations. Given that Mansour had traveled from Burnley to Bradford to carry out the attack, there was particular focus on his potential movements between these areas. During these 4 days, Kulsuma's family was left in a state of anguish that few can imagine. Not only were they grieving the loss of their beloved daughter, sister, and mother, but they were also living with the knowledge that her killer remained at large, potentially dangerous to others. The baby boy, now without either parent, his father having become his mother's murderer, was placed in the care of family members who were struggling to process their own grief while taking on the responsibility of raising this innocent child. Public appeals for information were made, with police urging anyone who had seen Mansour or had information about his whereabouts to come forward. The media coverage was extensive, with Mansour's photograph circulated widely in an effort to locate him quickly. For days after the murder, the manhunt came to an end. Habibur Mansour was arrested and charged with murder. The relief felt by law enforcement and the community was palpable. A dangerous individual was off the streets, and the process of seeking justice for Kulsuma could begin. But even as Mansour was taken into custody, questions remained. How had he been able to track Kulsuma to Bradford? Had there been warning signs that could have prevented this tragedy? What failures in the system had allowed a woman who had sought help and protection to be murdered by the very person she was trying to escape? The arrest of Habibur Mansour brought him into custody, but it also brought intense scrutiny to the events leading up to Kulsuma's murder. How had a woman who had reported domestic violence, who had fled to a refuge for safety, who had taken all the right steps to protect herself, still ended up murdered by her abuser? These questions led to investigations not just into the murder itself, but into the response of various agencies to Kulsuma's earlier reports of abuse. The Independent Office for Police Conduct, IOPC, announced that they would be investigating both West Yorkshire Police and Greater Manchester Police regarding their handling of the case. This investigation was significant because it suggested that there may have been prior contact between Kulsuma and law enforcement, contact that, in hindsight, might have been handled differently. When someone reports domestic violence, makes specific allegations of assault and threats to kill, and then is subsequently murdered by their abuser, it raises serious questions about whether all possible protective measures were taken. The IOPC investigation would examine the timeline of events, the response to Kulsuma's reports, the communication between different agencies, and whether established protocols for protecting domestic violence victims were properly followed. Such investigations are crucial for identifying systemic failures and preventing similar tragedies in the future. Meanwhile, Mansour was charged not only with murder but with a series of other offenses related to his pattern of abuse against Kulsuma. These charges included assault relating to the November 23 incident, making threats to kill from November 24, stalking, and possession of a bladed article. This comprehensive set of charges painted a picture of escalating abuse that culminated in murder. They showed that Kulsuma's death was not an isolated incident but the final act in a sustained campaign of violence and intimidation. As the legal process began, Mansour's defense strategy became apparent. He initially pleaded guilty to manslaughter and possession of a knife, but denied the murder charge. This legal distinction is significant. Manslaughter suggests a killing without premeditation, while murder requires proof of intent to kill or cause grievous bodily harm. However, the evidence suggested this was very much a premeditated act. Mansour had traveled specifically to find Kulsuma, he was carrying a knife, and the attack itself was so sustained and violent that it could only indicate intent to kill. The fact that he had previously sent her a photograph of her refuge, demonstrating ongoing stalking behavior, further supported the premeditation argument. He also denied the charges related to the November incidents, maintaining his position that Kulsuma had fabricated the domestic violence allegations. This denial, in the face of what had ultimately happened, seemed to demonstrate a complete lack of accountability for his actions. The trial of Habibur Mansour began in June 2025, more than a year after Kulsuma's murder. By this time, their son was approaching his second birthday, a child who would have no memory of his mother but whose life had been forever shaped by his father's actions. The courtroom proceedings would lay bare the full extent of the abuse Kulsuma had suffered and the events that led to her death. For her family, sitting through these proceedings would have been an ordeal, hearing the details of their loved one's final moments, confronting the man who had taken her from them, and reliving the trauma of her loss. The prosecution's case was built on the evidence collected during the investigation, the CCTV footage showing the attack, forensic evidence from the scene, witness testimonies, and the pattern of abuse that had preceded the murder. They argued that this was a deliberate, premeditated killing carried out by a man who could not accept that his wife had left him. The defense, meanwhile, maintained that while Mansour had indeed killed Kulsuma, it was manslaughter rather than murder. They suggested that he had not intended to kill her, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. During the trial, details emerged about the extent of Mansour's controlling behavior. The photograph he had sent to Kulsuma of her refuge was presented as evidence of stalking, demonstrating his refusal to accept that she had left him and his determination to maintain control over her even after she had fled to safety. Witnesses testified about what they had seen on that April afternoon in Bradford. Their accounts painted a picture of a sustained, vicious attack that showed no signs of being anything other than an intentional killing. The number of stab wounds, at least 25, spoke to a level of violence that went far beyond what might occur in a momentary loss of control. The trial also heard about the impact of Kulsuma's death on her family and community. Victim impact statements would have detailed the devastation felt by those who loved her, the ongoing trauma experienced by those who witnessed the attack, and the challenges faced by those now responsible for raising her orphaned son. Throughout the proceedings, Mansour showed little remorse for his actions. His continued denials in the face of overwhelming evidence suggested a man who either could not or would not accept responsibility for what he had done. After deliberating on the evidence presented to them, the jury reached their verdict. They found Habibur Mansour guilty of murder, rejecting his claims that this was a lesser charge of manslaughter. They also found him guilty on the other charges, assault, making threats to kill, and stalking. On July 22, 2025, Habibur Mansour stood before Bradford Crown Court to receive his sentence. Now 27 years old, the same age Kulsuma had been when he murdered her, he faced the consequences of his actions. Judge Recorder Mark Cotter, who presided over the sentencing, did not mince words in describing the crime. He characterized it as a sustained and excessively violent attack, in which Kulsuma suffered mentally and physically before her death as she tried to protect herself. The judge also noted the public nature of the attack, describing it as occurring in a busy city center location on a Saturday afternoon, a shocking event that would have traumatized witnesses. This detail was important because it demonstrated the complete disregard Mansour had shown not only for his wife's life but for the well-being of others who would be forced to witness his violence. The sentence handed down was life imprisonment with a minimum term of 28 years. This meant that Mansour would not be eligible for parole until he had served at least 28 years behind bars. Given his age at sentencing, this would make him 55 years old before he could even be considered for release, and release would be by no means guaranteed. A life sentence with a 28-year minimum term reflects the severity of the crime and the aggravating factors present in the case. These factors would have included the domestic violence context, the premeditated nature of the attack, the vulnerability of the victim, and the public setting of the crime. For Kulsuma's family, the sentence provided a measure of justice, but no sentence could ever truly compensate for their loss. In a statement released after the sentencing, they expressed their feelings about the man who had destroyed their family. They would never forgive the monster who had killed Kulsuma. Their statement continued, "No amount of time in prison will change the life sentence he has inflicted upon us all." This powerful phrase captured the reality that while Mansour would serve his time and might eventually be released, Kulsuma's family would serve their own life sentence, a lifetime of grief, loss, and wondering what might have been. The family's use of the word monster to describe Mansour was telling. It reflected their view that his actions had stripped him of his humanity, that someone capable of such violence against a vulnerable woman could no longer be considered a normal human being. The murder of Kulsuma actor was not an isolated incident but part of a broader pattern of violence against women, particularly in the context of domestic abuse. Statistics show that women are most at risk of being killed by intimate partners or ex-partners when they attempt to leave abusive relationships. This phenomenon, sometimes referred to as separation violence, occurs because leaving represents the ultimate challenge to an abuser's control. For someone like Habibur Mansour, who had demonstrated controlling and violent behavior throughout his relationship with Kulsuma, her decision to leave would have been seen as an unacceptable loss of power. Organizations like Karma Nirvana, which campaigns against honor-based abuse and forced marriage, responded to Kulsuma's case by highlighting the systemic issues that contribute to such tragedies. They emphasized that Kulsuma's murder was not an isolated act but part of a pattern of violence that affects women across all communities. The case also highlighted the challenges faced by women's refuges and support services. Despite being in a refuge, despite taking all the recommended steps to protect herself, Kulsuma was still tracked down and murdered by her abuser. This raises difficult questions about how to better protect women in such situations. The role of technology in modern stalking and harassment was another issue highlighted by this case. Mansour's ability to locate the refuge where Kulsuma was staying, and his decision to photograph the building and send the image to her, demonstrated how digital tools can be weaponized by abusers to maintain control over their victims. The case also raised questions about the response of various agencies to reports of domestic violence. The IOPC investigation into the police response was significant because it suggested there may have been opportunities to provide better protection to Kulsuma before the situation escalated to murder. For the South Asian community, Kulsuma's case was particularly resonant. Issues of domestic violence, controlling behavior, and the challenges faced by women trying to leave abusive relationships are present in all communities, but cultural factors can sometimes make it even more difficult for women to seek help or to be believed when they do. As the legal proceedings concluded and Habibur Mansour began his prison sentence, attention turned to remembering Kulsuma actor not just as a victim of domestic violence, but as a person who had lived, loved, and dreamed of a better future. Kulsuma was a young woman who had shown remarkable courage in her final months. Leaving an abusive relationship, particularly one involving threats to kill, requires extraordinary bravery. She had made the decision to prioritize her safety and that of her child over the familiar, even if that familiar was dangerous. Her devotion to her son was evident in every decision she made during those final months. She had fled to a refuge not just to save herself, but to ensure that her baby would grow up in a world free from violence. She had endured the uncertainty and difficulty of life in temporary accommodation because she believed it would give her child a better future. The image of Kulsuma pushing her baby's pram through Bradford city centre on that April afternoon represents both the ordinary and the extraordinary. Ordinary because it was such a normal activity, a young mother out with her child on a Saturday afternoon. Extraordinary because it represented a woman who had fought to reclaim her right to simple, everyday freedoms. Her baby, now being raised by family members, represents both the greatest tragedy and the greatest hope in this story. Tragedy because he will grow up without his mother, because his earliest years were shaped by violence he was too young to understand, because he will have to live with the knowledge that his father killed his mother. But hope because he is loved by the family that has taken him in, because he represents Kulsuma's legacy, because in his survival and growth, something of her lives on. He is the reason she found the courage to leave, the reason she fought so hard for safety, the reason her story matters beyond just another statistic of domestic violence. The friends and support workers who knew Kulsuma during her time at the refuge would remember her strength and determination. Despite everything she had endured, despite the fear she lived with daily, she was working toward building a new life. She was engaging with support services, following safety protocols, doing everything she could to protect herself and her child. The murder of Kulsuma actor serves as a stark reminder of the deadly reality of domestic violence and the particular dangers faced by women trying to leave abusive relationships. Her case has become part of the broader conversation about how society can better protect vulnerable women and prevent such tragedies. One of the most significant lessons from Kulsuma's case is that simply leaving an abusive relationship does not guarantee safety. In fact, statistics consistently show that the period immediately after leaving is often the most dangerous time for women escaping domestic violence. This is when the risk of serious injury or death is highest, as abusers often escalate their behavior when they realize they are losing control. The case also highlights the sophisticated methods modern abusers use to maintain control over their victims. Mansour's use of technology to track Kulsuma, his ability to locate her refuge, and his decision to photograph the building demonstrated a level of stalking behavior that goes beyond traditional concepts of domestic violence. For women's refuges and support services, Kulsuma's case raises difficult questions about how to provide better protection. The fact that Mansour was able to locate the refuge where she was staying suggests that current security protocols may not be sufficient to protect residents from determined stalkers. The response of law enforcement agencies is another area that has come under scrutiny. The IOPC investigation into the police response to Kulsuma's earlier reports will hopefully identify ways that protective measures could be improved in similar cases. The case has also contributed to ongoing discussions about the need for better coordination between different agencies involved in protecting domestic violence victims. When someone like Kulsuma is fleeing violence, they often interact with multiple services: police, social services, housing authorities, healthcare providers, and charitable organizations. Better communication and coordination between these agencies could potentially provide more comprehensive protection. For the legal system, the successful prosecution of Mansour for murder, rather than the lesser charge of manslaughter, sends an important message about how such cases are viewed. The 28-year minimum sentence reflects the serious nature of domestic violence homicides and may serve as a deterrent to others. The case has also been significant in raising awareness about domestic violence within South Asian communities. Organizations working to combat honor-based violence and forced marriage have used Kulsuma's story to highlight the universal nature of domestic abuse and the need for culturally sensitive support services. The impact of Kulsuma's murder extended far beyond her immediate family, creating ripples that affected the entire community and beyond. The witnesses who saw the attack on that April afternoon were left with trauma that would likely affect them for years to come. Seeing such extreme violence, particularly against a young mother with a baby, is not something that people easily forget or recover from. The staff at the refuge where Kulsuma had been staying would have been deeply affected by her death. These dedicated professionals work with vulnerable women every day, doing their best to provide safety and support. When one of their residents is murdered by the very person they were trying to escape, it represents a failure of the system they work within, even if that failure was not their fault. The broader community of Bradford was also impacted. The city center location of the attack meant that many people were exposed to the aftermath, even if they didn't witness the attack itself. The area was cordoned off, police cars and ambulances were everywhere, and the news of what had happened spread quickly through the community. For other women experiencing domestic violence, Kulsuma's case would have sent a chilling message. Here was someone who had done everything right. She had reported the abuse, she had left, she had sought professional help, she had gone to a refuge, and she was still killed by her abuser. This could have made some women more reluctant to seek help, fearing that leaving might make them more vulnerable rather than safer. Conversely, the case also highlighted the vital importance of support services for domestic violence victims. Despite the tragic outcome, the refuge had provided Kulsuma with months of safety and support. Without these services, she might have been living in even greater danger for a longer period. The case also had implications for Mansour's extended family and community. They too had to grapple with the reality that someone they knew had committed such a horrific crime. The shame and stigma associated with having a family member convicted of murder would have affected them all. In the digital age, the case also became part of online discussions about domestic violence, women's safety, and the failures of protective systems. Social media platforms became spaces where people shared their own experiences of abuse, discussed the warning signs, and debated what could have been done differently to save Kulsuma's life. The case also influenced policy discussions at various levels of government. When such high-profile domestic violence murders occur, they often prompt reviews of existing legislation and procedures. Politicians and policymakers use these tragic cases to argue for better funding for women's refuges, improved training for police officers, and stronger legal protections for domestic violence victims. To fully comprehend the tragedy that befell Kulsuma Akhtar, it's important to understand the psychology behind domestic violence and the mindset that drives someone like Habibur Mansour to commit such extreme acts of violence. Domestic abusers often exhibit a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond physical violence. They typically seek to control every aspect of their victim's life, their social connections, their movements, their finances, even their thoughts and feelings. This control is often maintained through a combination of physical violence, emotional manipulation, threats, and isolation. For someone like Mansour, Kulsuma's decision to leave would have represented the ultimate challenge to his authority. In his mind, she belonged to him, and her attempt to assert independence would have been seen as an unacceptable betrayal. This possessive mindset is at the heart of many domestic violence cases, and it often becomes most dangerous when the victim tries to leave. The escalating nature of Mansour's behavior, from controlling behavior to physical assault to threats to kill, and finally to stalking and murder, follows a pattern that researchers have identified in many domestic violence cases. Each boundary that is crossed makes the next escalation easier, and each time the victim submits to the abuse, the abuser's sense of power and entitlement grows. Mansour's use of technology to track and harass Kulsuma also reflects how modern abusers have adapted their methods. The photograph of the refuge that he sent to her was a sophisticated form of psychological warfare, designed to destroy her sense of safety and demonstrate that no matter where she hid, he could find her. His later claims that Kulsuma had fabricated the domestic violence allegations also fit a common pattern. Many abusers genuinely believe that they are the victims in the relationship, that their partner's attempts to seek help or leave are forms of betrayal or manipulation. This self-serving narrative allows them to justify increasingly extreme behavior. The fact that Mansour maintained a social media presence as a YouTuber while privately terrorizing his wife also demonstrates the dual nature that many abusers exhibit. To the outside world, they can appear charming, normal, even charismatic. This public persona makes it harder for victims to be believed when they report abuse, and it allows abusers to manipulate public perception in their favor. As we reach the end of Kulsuma Akhtar's story, were left with a profound sense of loss and a determination that her death should not be in vain. She was a young woman who showed remarkable courage in trying to protect herself and her child from an increasingly dangerous situation. Despite taking all the recommended steps, reporting the abuse, leaving the relationship, seeking professional help, and going to a refuge, she was still murdered by the man who should have been her protector. The 28-year minimum sentence handed down to Habibur Mansour reflects the severity of his crime and sends a message about how such cases will be treated by the justice system. But no sentence can bring Kulsuma back or undo the trauma inflicted on her family, her child, and the community that witnessed her murder. Her story serves as a reminder that domestic violence can affect anyone, regardless of their background, education, or social status. It also demonstrates that leaving an abusive relationship, while necessary, does not guarantee safety and that society must do more to protect vulnerable women. The baby boy who survived this tragedy represents both the greatest sadness and the greatest hope in this story. He will grow up without his mother, but he will be surrounded by family members who loved Kulsuma and who will ensure that her memory lives on through him. In his survival and growth, something of her courage and love continues. Kulsuma Akhtar was 27 years old when she died. She should have had decades ahead of her to watch her son grow up, to see him take his first steps, speak his first words, start school, and become the man she dreamed he would be. She should have had the chance to build the safe, peaceful life she was fighting for. Instead, her life was cut short by the violence of a man who could not accept that she had the right to leave him. But in her brief life, she showed extraordinary courage, devoted love for her child, and an unwavering belief that a better life was possible. These qualities define her legacy far more than the circumstances of her death. As we remember Kulsuma Akhtar, let us commit to doing better as a society to protect women like her. Let us work to ensure that the systems designed to help domestic violence victims are robust enough to actually keep them safe. And let us never forget that behind every statistic about domestic violence is a real person with hopes, dreams, and people who loved them. Kulsuma's story ends here, but the work of protecting other women in similar situations continues. May her memory inspire us to do better, and may her son grow up in a world that is safer for all children. Rest in peace, Kulsuma Akhtar. You deserved so much more than the hand you were dealt, but in your short life, you showed us what love, courage, and determination look like in the face of unimaginable adversity. Your story will not be forgotten. I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our third story. Story 3. Tonight, we're traveling back to the summer of 1976, to a New York City gripped by fear, where the sounds of sirens and police helicopters became the unwelcome soundtrack to sleepless nights. This is the story of David Berkowitz, a troubled young man whose descent into darkness would earn him the chilling moniker, Son of Sam. On a warm June day in 1953, a baby boy was born to an unwed mother named Betty Falco in Brooklyn, New York. The child's father was Joseph Kleinman, a married real estate agent who had conducted an affair with Betty while she was separated from her husband. Unable to care for the child, Betty made the difficult decision to give him up for adoption. The baby, originally named Richard David Falco, was soon placed with Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz, a middle-class Jewish couple living in the Bronx who had been unable to have children of their own. They reversed his names, calling him David Richard Berkowitz, and welcomed him into their comfortable home on Stratford Avenue. Nathan Berkowitz was a hardware store owner, a quiet man who worked long hours to provide for his family. Pearl was devoted to her new son, perhaps overly so. She showered David with attention and material possessions, creating what some would later describe as an almost suffocating environment of care. From the beginning, David was different. His adoptive parents noticed his intelligence. He was clearly bright, with an IQ that tested above average, But there was something else, something harder to define. He was moody, prone to sudden outbursts of anger that seemed disproportionate to whatever had triggered them. As a small child, he would throw violent tantrums that left his parents bewildered and exhausted. The neighborhood children found David difficult to be around. He was simultaneously desperate for attention and hostile toward those who might give it to him. He would insert himself into games and activities, only to become aggressive when things didn't go his way. Teachers reported that he was disruptive in class, though his academic performance remained adequate. But it was Pearl who seemed to understand David best, or at least who tried the hardest to reach him. She would spend hours talking with him, trying to soothe his troubled spirit. When other parents complained about David's behavior, Pearl defended him fiercely. When teachers suggested he might benefit from counseling, Pearl resisted, believing that love and patience would be enough to heal whatever was troubling her son. As David entered his teenage years, his behavior became more concerning. He began to show signs of what would later be recognized as serious psychological disturbance. He became obsessed with small acts of destruction, setting small fires, killing insects with elaborate cruelty, and engaging in petty theft. His grades began to slip as he lost interest in school, spending his time instead on these darker pursuits. The Berkowitz family lived in a changing neighborhood. The Bronx of David's youth was transitioning from the relatively stable, middle-class community of the 1950s to the more troubled urban landscape of the 1960s. Crime was rising, racial tensions were increasing, and many families were beginning their exodus to the suburbs. For a boy already struggling with internal turmoil, the external chaos of his environment may have contributed to his growing sense of alienation and rage. David's relationship with his father Nathan was complex and often strained. Nathan was a traditional man who believed in discipline and hard work, but he found himself increasingly unable to connect with his troubled son. When David acted out, Nathan's responses were often harsh, creating a cycle of resentment and rebellion that would continue for years. Pearl, meanwhile, continued to be David's primary source of stability and love. She was the one person who seemed able to calm him during his worst moments, the one person he trusted completely. This makes what happened next all the more devastating. In 1967, when David was 14 years old, Pearl Berkowitz was diagnosed with breast cancer. The disease progressed rapidly, and despite treatment, she died within months of the diagnosis. For David, losing Pearl wasn't just losing a mother, it was losing the one person who had ever truly understood him, the one person who had believed in his capacity for good. The effect on David was immediate and profound. His grades, already poor, plummeted completely. His behavior became more erratic and violent. He began to spend long hours walking the streets of the Bronx, sometimes not returning home until well after midnight. When Nathan tried to impose discipline, David would explode in rage, sometimes throwing furniture or punching walls. Nathan, grieving his wife's death and struggling to manage his increasingly difficult son, did his best to hold the family together. But he was a man out of his depth, trying to parent a deeply troubled teenager while dealing with his own profound loss. The father-son relationship, never strong, began to deteriorate completely. In 1971, Nathan made a decision that would have lasting consequences for both him and David. He remarried, choosing a woman named Margaret who came with children of her own from a previous marriage. Nathan hoped that Margaret could provide some stability for David, perhaps even serve as a maternal figure. David's reaction was explosive. He saw Margaret not as a potential stepmother, but as an intruder, someone who was trying to replace his beloved Pearl. The new family dynamic was chaotic, with David openly hostile to Margaret and her children, and Margaret increasingly frustrated with Nathan's inability to control his son. The tension in the household became unbearable. David's behavior escalated. He was staying out all night, getting into fights at school, and showing signs of what would now be recognized as serious depression and possible psychosis. He began to talk about hearing voices, about feeling controlled by forces outside himself. Finally, Nathan made the decision that may have sealed David's fate. In 1971, Nathan moved to Florida with Margaret, leaving 18-year-old David behind in New York. The abandonment, for that's how David saw it, was the final blow to an already fractured psyche. Alone in New York, David drifted for several months. He lived in a series of cheap apartments, worked a series of dead-end jobs, and became increasingly isolated from society. It was during this period that he made a decision that would change the trajectory of his life. He enlisted in the United States Army. The Army seemed, at first, to be exactly what David Berkowitz needed. The structure, the discipline, the clear hierarchy of command, all of it provided a framework that had been missing from his chaotic civilian life. David was sent to Fort Knox, Kentucky for basic training, and then to South Korea for a tour of duty. In the military, David found something he had never experienced before: he was good at something. He was an excellent marksman, with a natural ability to hit targets at long distances. His instructors noted his precision and focus when he had a rifle in his hands. For the first time in his life, David received genuine praise and recognition for his abilities. He served his tour of duty without major incident, though those who knew him during this time would later recall that he seemed isolated even among his fellow soldiers. He didn't form close friendships, didn't participate in the camaraderie that typically develops among men serving together in difficult conditions. He was competent, reliable, but distant. When David returned to civilian life in 1974, he was a changed man, but not necessarily for the better. The discipline and structure that had kept him stable in the Army was gone, replaced by the familiar chaos of civilian life in New York City. He took a job with the Postal Service, a position that should have provided stability and a decent income. But David was struggling with what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress, combined with the unresolved psychological issues that had plagued him since childhood. He moved into a small apartment in Yonkers, just north of the Bronx, and began to withdraw into himself more and more completely. His neighbors in the apartment building would later describe him as quiet, perhaps a little strange, but not obviously dangerous. He kept to himself, rarely spoke to anyone, and seemed to live a solitary existence. What they didn't see was the internal turmoil that was consuming him. David began to experience what he would later describe as auditory hallucinations. He claimed that his neighbor's dog, a black Labrador named Harvey, was speaking to him, delivering messages from Sam, who David believed was an ancient demon. These voices, David said, were commanding him to commit acts of violence. Whether these hallucinations were genuine symptoms of mental illness or elaborate fantasies that David created to justify his growing urges toward violence remains a subject of debate among psychiatrists and criminologists. What is clear is that during this period, David's grip on reality was becoming increasingly tenuous. He began to spend his nights walking the streets of New York City, particularly the outer boroughs where young people gathered. He was drawn to couples, particularly young couples who might be sitting in cars or walking together in romantic settings. He would watch them from a distance, developing an intense hatred for what he saw as their happiness and normalcy. David's hatred seemed to focus particularly on young women with long, dark hair. He would later claim that these women reminded him of the girls who had rejected him in high school, or that they represented some form of evil that needed to be destroyed. The truth was likely more complex. These women represented everything that David felt he could never have: youth, beauty, love, and a normal life. As 1975 progressed, David's mental state continued to deteriorate. He quit his job with the Postal Service and took a position as a security guard, work that allowed him to be alone for long periods and gave him access to weapons. He began to arm himself, first with knives, and eventually with a .44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog revolver. The gun was significant. It was a powerful weapon, capable of causing massive damage, but it was also relatively easy to conceal and use. David practiced with it obsessively, maintaining the marksmanship skills he had developed in the Army. He told himself that he was preparing for the mission that Sam had given him. On Christmas Eve 1975, David made his first attempt at murder. Armed with a knife, he approached a young woman named Michelle Foreman as she was leaving a store in the Bronx. He stabbed her repeatedly, but somehow she survived the attack. David fled into the night, exhilarated by the violence but frustrated that his victim had not died. The attack on Michelle Foreman was a turning point. David had crossed the line from fantasy to action, from thinking about violence to actually committing it. The experience was intoxicating for him, the power, the control, the ability to cause fear and pain. It was also the beginning of what would become a year-long reign of terror. Over the following months, David would commit several more attacks with knives and other weapons. Most of these early attacks were not fatal, and many were not even reported to police or were dismissed as random street crimes. But David was learning, refining his techniques, and building towards something much more terrible. July 29, 1976, was a warm summer evening in the Bronx. Donna Lauria, an 18-year-old nursing student, had spent the day with her friend Jody Valenti at a disco in New Rochelle. It was the kind of carefree summer evening that young people in New York had been enjoying for generations: music, dancing, laughter, and the promise of romance in the warm night air. As they drove back to the Bronx in Jody's car, the two young women were chatting about the evening, about the boys they had met, about their plans for the rest of the summer. Donna was excited about starting her nursing program in the fall. She was a bright, ambitious young woman with her whole life ahead of her. They arrived at Donna's apartment building on Burr Avenue in the Pelham Bay section of the Bronx just after 1 o'clock in the morning. As was typical for the time and neighborhood, they sat in the car for a few minutes, continuing their conversation. The street was quiet, peaceful, the kind of residential area where families felt safe letting their children play outside and where young people could walk home alone at night without fear. What they didn't know was that they were being watched. David Berkowitz had been prowling the neighborhood for hours, looking for what he would later call suitable targets. He had parked his car several blocks away and was moving through the shadows on foot, carrying his .44 caliber revolver. From David's perspective, Donna and Jody represented everything he hated about the world. They were young, attractive, popular, everything he felt he could never be. They had friends, relationships, futures filled with possibility. In his twisted worldview, they deserved to die simply for having what he could not have. He approached the car silently, keeping to the shadows until he was just a few feet away. Then, without warning, he pulled out his gun and fired several shots through the passenger side window where Donna was sitting. The sound of the gunshots shattered the quiet night. Donna was hit in the neck and killed almost instantly. Jody was wounded but survived, though she would carry both physical and psychological scars for the rest of her life. David disappeared into the darkness as quickly as he had appeared, leaving behind a scene of chaos and horror. The first police officers to arrive at the scene found Jody stumbling around the car in shock, blood streaming from her wounds, screaming for help. Donna was slumped over in the passenger seat, her life already gone. The car windows were shattered, and the pavement was covered with broken glass and blood. For the NYPD, this appeared to be a random street crime, terrible but not unusual for New York City in the 1970s. The city was struggling with high crime rates, and shootings were not uncommon. The investigation began routinely, with detectives canvassing the neighborhood, looking for witnesses, trying to understand what had happened and why. But this was no ordinary crime, and David Berkowitz was no ordinary criminal. He had tasted blood, and he wanted more. The weeks following Donna Lauria's murder were relatively quiet. David returned to his normal routine, going to work, coming home to his apartment, maintaining the facade of an ordinary life. But inside, he was reliving the shooting over and over again, savoring the memory of the power he had felt in that moment. He began to plan his next attack more carefully. He studied the newspapers to learn about the police investigation, looking for clues about what they knew and what they didn't know. He was pleased to discover that they had very few leads and no clear suspects. He began to believe that he could continue killing without being caught. On October 23, 1976, nearly 3 months after the murder of Donna Lauria, David struck again. This time his targets were Carl Denaro and Rosemary Keenan, a young couple who had been attending a party in Queens. They were sitting in Carl's car outside Rosemary's home when David approached. Once again, he appeared from nowhere, fired several shots, and disappeared into the night. Carl was struck in the head but survived, though he required multiple surgeries and suffered permanent injuries. Rosemary was physically unharmed but traumatized by the experience. The police initially didn't connect this shooting to the murder of Donna Lauria. The locations were in different boroughs, the circumstances were slightly different, and random shootings were unfortunately common enough in New York that a pattern wasn't immediately obvious. But David was just getting started. On November 27, 1976, he attacked again, this time shooting Donna DeMazie and Joanne Lomino as they walked home from a movie in Queens. Both young women survived, though Joanne was left paralyzed from the waist down. By this point, some detectives were beginning to see connections between the shootings. The victims were all young, most were in couples, and all the attacks had occurred late at night in residential areas of the outer boroughs. The weapon appeared to be the same in each case, a powerful handgun that left distinctive ballistic evidence. A special task force was formed to investigate what police were now calling the .44 caliber killer case, named after the weapon that was being used in the attacks. The task force included some of the NYPD's best detectives, but they were working with very little evidence. The killer left no fingerprints, no witnesses had gotten a clear look at him, and his attacks seemed to follow no clear pattern. What the police didn't realize was that there was a pattern, but it existed only in David Berkowitz's disturbed mind. He wasn't choosing his victims randomly, he was selecting them based on his own twisted criteria. Young couples represented happiness and normalcy, things that he felt had been denied to him. Women with long, dark hair reminded him of girls who had rejected him or who represented some form of evil in his delusional worldview. As winter turned to spring in 1977, New York City was beginning to live in fear. The newspapers were calling him the .44 caliber killer, and the story was front-page news almost daily. Citizens were changing their behavior, avoiding being out alone at night, staying away from parked cars, looking over their shoulders constantly. But if the city thought the worst was over, they were tragically mistaken. David Berkowitz was entering the most prolific and deadly phase of his killing spree. On January 30, 1977, David struck again, this time targeting Christine Freund, a 26-year-old secretary who was sitting in a car with her boyfriend John Deal in Queens. The couple had been at a movie and were sitting in John's car outside Christine's apartment building when David approached. He fired several shots through the passenger window, killing Christine instantly. John was unharmed physically but was devastated by the loss of the woman he loved. The murder of Christine Freund marked a turning point in both the investigation and the public's awareness of the case. This was the second confirmed murder, and the ballistic evidence clearly linked all the shootings to the same weapon. The NYPD was now facing intense pressure from the media and the public to catch the killer. The task force assigned to the case was expanded, with detectives working around the clock to follow up on leads and tips. They received hundreds of calls from frightened citizens reporting suspicious activity, but none of the leads panned out. The killer seemed to be a ghost, appearing long enough to commit his crimes and then vanishing without a trace. What made the case even more frustrating for investigators was that David was constantly changing his methods and locations. He never struck in the same place twice, never followed a predictable schedule, and never left any physical evidence that could be traced back to him. He was careful, methodical, and apparently very intelligent. On March 8, 1977, David committed what may have been his most brazen attack yet. Virginia Voskerikian, a 19-year-old college student, was walking home from classes at Columbia University when David approached her on a street in Forest Hills, Queens. Unlike his previous attacks, which had all involved victims in cars, this was a face-to-face encounter. Virginia saw David approaching and may have realized she was in danger. She raised her textbooks in front of her face in a defensive gesture, but David simply fired through the books, killing her instantly. The bullet passed through her textbooks and struck her in the head, and she collapsed on the sidewalk just a few hundred feet from her home. The murder of Virginia Voskerikian sent shockwaves through New York City. This wasn't just another shooting of people in a parked car, this was a young woman murdered on the street while walking home from school, something that could happen to anyone. The randomness and brutality of the attack terrified the public and intensified the pressure on police to solve the case. By this point, the media coverage was constant and intense. The New York newspapers were competing with each other to provide the most complete coverage of the case, and television news programs were leading with updates on the investigation every night. The killer was becoming a household name, even though no one knew who he was. David was following the media coverage obsessively. He bought multiple newspapers every day, watched every news broadcast, and reveled in the fear and attention his crimes were generating. For a man who had felt invisible and ignored for most of his life, the knowledge that an entire city was talking about him was intoxicating. But David wasn't content to remain anonymous. He wanted more recognition, more attention, more fear. And so he made a decision that would ultimately lead to his downfall. He decided to communicate directly with the police and the media. On April 17, 1977, David Berkowitz committed what would become one of his most infamous attacks, not just because of the violence involved, but because of what he left behind at the scene. Alexander Esau, 20 years old, and Valentina Suriani, 18, were sitting in a borrowed car on a quiet street in the Bronx. They had been dating for several months and were very much in love. Alex was a tow truck driver, a hardworking young man who was saving money to start his own business. Valentina was a student and part-time office worker, a bright, ambitious young woman with dreams of a career in fashion. They had spent the evening at a movie and were parked outside Valentina's apartment building, talking quietly and enjoying each other's company. The street was dark and peaceful, the kind of place where young couples had been parking for generations without fear. David approached the car silently, moving through the shadows with the skill he had developed over months of stalking victims. He raised his .44 caliber revolver and fired several shots through the car windows. Both Alex and Valentina were killed instantly, their promising young lives ended in a moment of senseless violence. But this time, David didn't simply disappear into the night. Instead, he left something behind, a handwritten letter addressed to the police, placed carefully near the car where it would be found by investigators. The letter was rambling, filled with strange references and bizarre claims, but it provided the first real insight into the mind of the killer who had been terrorizing New York City for nearly a year. Most significantly, it was signed, Son of Sam. In the letter, David wrote about being commanded to kill by a demon named Sam, who spoke to him through a neighbor's dog. He claimed that he was just following orders, that he had no choice in the matter. The letter was filled with references to blood, death, and an apocalyptic vision of New York City being destroyed. "I am a monster," David wrote. "I am the son of Sam. I am a little brat. When Father Sam gets drunk he gets mean. He beats his family. Sometimes he ties me up to the back of the house. Other times he locks me in the garage. Sam loves to drink blood. Go out and kill," commands Father Sam. The letter continued with increasingly bizarre claims and threats. David promised that he would continue killing, that no one could stop him, that he was on a mission from Sam to cleanse the city of evil. He mocked the police for their inability to catch him and predicted that his next attack would be even more spectacular. When detectives found the letter, they immediately recognized its significance. This was the first direct communication from the killer, the first glimpse into his psychology and motivations. The letter was rushed to the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit, where experts began to create a psychological profile of the man they were hunting. The profile that emerged was troubling. The killer appeared to be highly intelligent but severely mentally ill. He seemed to have a grandiose sense of his own importance and a deep hatred for society, particularly young couples and attractive women. He was organized enough to plan and execute his attacks without leaving physical evidence, but disorganized enough to believe that he was receiving commands from demons. The "Son of Sam" letter was kept secret from the public initially, as police hoped to use details from it to verify future communications or to trip up suspects during questioning. But the media had gotten wind of the fact that the killer had communicated with police, and the pressure to release details was intense. On June 1, 1977, Police Commissioner Michael Codd made the decision to release excerpts from the letter to the public. The effect was immediate and dramatic. If New Yorkers had been frightened before, they were now terrified. The letter revealed that they weren't just dealing with a random killer, they were facing someone who appeared to be completely insane, someone who believed he was on a mission from hell itself. The name, Son of Sam, became part of the city's vocabulary overnight. Newspaper headlines screamed about the latest developments in the case, television news programs devoted entire broadcasts to analyzing the letter, and citizens began to change their behavior even more dramatically. Sales of large dogs increased as people sought protection. Gun sales skyrocketed as citizens armed themselves. Hair salons reported a surge in women asking to cut their long, dark hair short or dye it blonde, as word spread that the killer seemed to target women with dark hair. Nightclubs and restaurants in the outer boroughs saw their business plummet as people avoided being out at night. The police department, meanwhile, was under enormous pressure. The Son of Sam task force had grown to include over 200 detectives, making it one of the largest manhunts in New York City history. They were following up on thousands of tips, interviewing hundreds of suspects, and working around the clock to catch the killer. But David Berkowitz was still out there, and he wasn't finished. The summer of 1977 was shaping up to be one of the most difficult in New York City's history. The city was facing a financial crisis, a massive blackout had plunged much of the city into darkness and chaos, and hanging over everything was the constant fear of the Son of Sam. By this point, David's crimes had fundamentally changed the way New Yorkers lived their lives. Couples avoided sitting in parked cars. Young people traveled in groups rather than alone. Parents kept their children inside after dark. The city that never sleeps was gripped by an insomnia of fear. David was well aware of the effect he was having on the city, and he was enjoying it immensely. He continued to follow the media coverage obsessively, clipping newspaper articles about his crimes and keeping them in a scrapbook. He felt powerful, important, feared, all things he had never experienced before in his life. On June 26, 1977, David decided to escalate his campaign of terror. He attacked Sal Lupo and Judy Placido as they sat in a car outside a discotheque in Queens. Both were wounded but survived, though they would carry the physical and psychological scars of the attack for the rest of their lives. What made this attack particularly significant was its location and timing. The shooting occurred outside Elifa's, a popular disco in Queens, just as the nightclub was letting out. There were dozens of potential witnesses, and David's willingness to attack in such a public setting suggested that he was becoming more reckless, more confident, or both. Following this attack, David sent another letter, this time to columnist Jimmy Breslin of the New York Daily News. Breslin had been writing about the Son of Sam case extensively, and David apparently felt that the columnist understood him better than the police did. The letter to Breslin was even more disturbing than the first communication. David wrote about his plans to attack again, promised that the killing would continue, and mocked both the police and the citizens of New York for their inability to stop him. He also provided details about his previous crimes that only the killer could have known, confirming his identity. Hello from the gutters of New York City, which are filled with dog manure, vomit, stale wine, urine and blood, the letter began. Hello from the sewers of New York City which swallow up these delicacies when they are washed away by the sweeper trucks. David went on to write about his hatred for the city and its people, his belief that he was doing God's work by killing, and his promise to continue the murders. He signed the letter, Son of Sam, and included a symbol that he claimed was his personal mark. The Breslin letter was published in the Daily News, causing another wave of panic throughout the city. The fact that the killer was not only still at large but was actively taunting the authorities and the media made him seem even more dangerous and unpredictable. The police response was swift and massive. The Son of Sam task force was expanded again, with detectives working 18-hour shifts and following up on every possible lead. The FBI increased their involvement in the case, providing additional behavioral analysis and investigative resources. But despite all these efforts, David remained one step ahead of the investigation. He was careful about when and where he struck, he left no physical evidence that could be traced back to him, and he seemed to have an almost supernatural ability to disappear after each attack. What the police didn't realize was that David's apparent invincibility was partly due to luck and partly due to his intimate knowledge of the city. He had grown up in the Bronx, he knew the outer boroughs well, and he understood how to move through the urban landscape without being noticed. He also benefited from the fact that this was before the era of widespread surveillance cameras and DNA analysis, technologies that would have made his crimes much more difficult to commit and get away with. As the summer of 1977 progressed, the pressure on the police department became almost unbearable. Mayor Abraham Beame was facing criticism for the city's inability to catch the killer. Police Commissioner Michael Codd was being called on to resign. The media was questioning every aspect of the investigation. And still, David Berkowitz was out there, planning his next attack. By July 1977, David Berkowitz had been killing for exactly 1 year. 6 people were dead, 7 others had been wounded, and an entire city was living in fear. The Son of Sam had become more than just a serial killer, he had become a symbol of urban decay, random violence, and the apparent powerlessness of law enforcement in the face of evil. But unknown to David, the massive police investigation was finally beginning to bear fruit. The hundreds of detectives working the case had interviewed thousands of suspects, followed up on tens of thousands of tips, and slowly but methodically eliminated possibilities. They were closing in on their target, even though they didn't yet realize it. On July 31, 1977, David decided to commit what he planned to be his most spectacular attack yet. He had chosen his location carefully, a neighborhood in Brooklyn where young people gathered at night, where there would be plenty of potential victims and witnesses to spread the terror. His targets were Stacy Moskowitz, a 20-year-old bank employee, and Robert Violante, her boyfriend. They had gone to see a movie at a local theater and were sitting in Robert's car in a park near the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, talking quietly and enjoying the warm summer evening. The location was significant for several reasons. First, it was in Brooklyn, a borough where David had not previously attacked, suggesting that his hunting ground was expanding. Second, it was a popular spot for young couples, meaning there were likely to be other potential victims in the area. Third, it was near several major highways, providing multiple escape routes. David approached the car around 2:40 in the morning, when the park was nearly empty and most of the other couples had gone home. He raised his .44 caliber revolver and fired several shots through the passenger side window where Stacy was sitting. Stacy was struck in the head and died 38 hours later in the hospital, becoming David's 6th murder victim. Robert was also shot, suffering severe injuries to his eyes that left him partially blind, but he survived the attack. But this time, something was different. This time, David had made a mistake that would ultimately lead to his capture. Earlier that evening, David had parked his car near the scene of the planned attack and had walked several blocks to the park. While he was gone, his car had been ticketed for parking next to a fire hydrant, a routine violation that happened thousands of times every day in New York City. Normally, such a minor parking ticket would have been meaningless. But one of the witnesses to the shooting, a young woman named Casilia Davis, had noticed a man running from the scene shortly after the shots were fired. She had also noticed a yellow Ford Galaxy speeding away from the area moments later. When detectives began their canvass of the area the next day, they discovered the parking ticket that had been issued to David's car. The timing and location were too coincidental to ignore. The ticket had been issued just a few hours before the shooting, and the car had been parked only a few blocks from the scene. The ticket led investigators to David Richard Berkowitz of 35 Pine Street in Yonkers. When they ran his name through their databases, they found that he had no criminal record and appeared to be a model citizen, a postal worker with no history of violence or mental illness. But when detectives drove to his address to question him as a potential witness, they made a startling discovery. Parked outside his apartment building was a yellow Ford Galaxy that matched the description given by Cassilia Davis. Even more significantly, when they looked through the car's windows, they could see what appeared to be a rifle stock protruding from under a seat. The discovery of the weapon gave police probable cause for a search warrant, but they decided to wait and watch the building to see if the car's owner would appear. They didn't have to wait long. On the evening of August 10, 1977, David Berkowitz walked out of his apartment building and approached his car. Detective John Falotico, who had been watching from across the street, approached him and asked if he was David Berkowitz. When David confirmed his identity, Falotico asked him to step away from the vehicle. "Well, you got me," David said calmly, as if he had been expecting this moment for months. "What took you so long?" When police searched David's car, they found a .44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog revolver, the same model weapon that had been used in all the Son of Sam attacks. Ballistic tests would later confirm that this was indeed the murder weapon. They also found a duffel bag containing ammunition, maps of the crime scenes, and what appeared to be plans for future attacks. In David's apartment, they discovered an extensive collection of newspaper clippings about the Son of Sam case, letters he had written but never sent, and a diary filled with disturbing entries about his crimes and his plans for future attacks. The arrest of David Berkowitz sent shockwaves throughout New York City. After more than a year of terror, the Son of Sam had finally been caught. The man who had held an entire city hostage was revealed to be an unremarkable-looking 24-year-old postal worker who lived alone in a modest apartment and had no history of serious crime. In the hours and days following his arrest, David Berkowitz began to tell his story to police interrogators, psychiatrists, and anyone else who would listen. What emerged was a portrait of a deeply disturbed individual whose descent into madness had been years in the making. Initially, David stuck to the story he had outlined in his letters to police and the media. He claimed that he had been receiving commands from a demon named Sam, who spoke to him through his neighbor's dog, Harvey. According to David, Sam was an ancient entity who demanded blood sacrifices, and David was merely his unwilling servant. "The demons were protecting me," David told investigators. "I had no choice. When Sam spoke, I had to obey. He would torture me if I didn't do what he commanded." David described elaborate conversations with Sam, detailed instructions about when and where to attack, and threats of supernatural punishment if he disobeyed. He claimed that his apartment was filled with demons, that he could hear voices coming from the walls, and that he was part of a larger supernatural conspiracy involving witches, devils, and other evil forces. But as psychiatrists and investigators spent more time with David, a more complex picture began to emerge. While David clearly suffered from some form of mental illness, there were aspects of his story that seemed calculated, almost theatrical. Some experts began to suspect that the Son of Sam persona was at least partly a performance, a way for David to deflect responsibility for his crimes while maintaining the notoriety he craved. Dr. David Abrahamson, a psychiatrist who examined David extensively, concluded that while David did suffer from paranoid psychosis, he was also manipulating his symptoms to avoid taking full responsibility for his actions. "He was both mad and bad," Dr. Abrahamson would later write. "He was mentally ill, but he was also evil." What became clear was that David's crimes were driven by a complex mixture of mental illness, sexual frustration, hatred of society, and a desperate need for attention and recognition. The Son of Sam persona allowed him to feel powerful and important for the first time in his life, while the supernatural elements of his story provided a convenient excuse for his actions. David's apartment, when thoroughly searched, revealed the extent of his obsession with his crimes. He had kept detailed records of his attacks, including maps showing the locations, photographs cut from newspapers, and handwritten notes analyzing the police investigation. He had also been planning future attacks, with lists of potential targets and detailed strategies for avoiding capture. Perhaps most disturbing were David's personal writings, which revealed the depth of his hatred for the people around him. He wrote extensively about his neighbors, his co-workers, and random strangers he encountered, describing elaborate fantasies of violence and revenge. Women were particular targets of his hatred, especially attractive women who he felt had rejected or ignored him. "I see them on the street, laughing, happy, living their perfect little lives," David wrote in one diary entry. "They don't even know I exist. But I'll make them notice me. I'll make them all notice me." The writings revealed that David's crimes were not random acts of madness, but carefully planned attacks designed to maximum terror and publicity. He had studied the media coverage of his crimes obsessively, adjusting his methods and his communications to generate more fear and attention. During his interrogations, David occasionally dropped his demonic possession act and spoke more directly about his motivations. He admitted that he was angry at the world, that he felt he had been cheated out of a normal life, and that killing innocent people was his way of getting revenge on a society that had rejected him. "I wanted to make them pay," he said during one interview. "All those happy couples, all those pretty girls who thought they were better than me. I wanted them to know what fear felt like." The legal case against David Berkowitz was remarkably straightforward from an evidentiary standpoint. The ballistic evidence linking him to all the shootings was overwhelming. He had confessed to the crimes, and the physical evidence found in his possession left no doubt about his guilt. The only real question was whether David was mentally competent to stand trial and, if convicted, whether he should receive the death penalty or life imprisonment. New York State had recently reinstated capital punishment, and there was enormous public pressure to execute the son of Sam. David's defense attorneys faced a difficult challenge. Their client had clearly committed the crimes, and his bizarre behavior and claims about demonic possession made it difficult to present a coherent defense strategy. They ultimately decided to pursue an insanity defense, arguing that David was so severely mentally ill that he could not be held responsible for his actions. A series of court-appointed psychiatrists examined David over several months, and their conclusions were mixed. Most agreed that David suffered from some form of mental illness, but they disagreed about the severity of his condition and whether it met the legal standard for insanity. Dr. Richard Wiedenbacher, one of the examining psychiatrists, concluded that David was a paranoid schizophrenic who genuinely believed he was receiving commands from supernatural forces. Dr. Wiedenbacher argued that David's illness was so severe that he could not distinguish between right and wrong at the time of his crimes. But other experts disagreed. Dr. Abrahamson and several other psychiatrists concluded that while David was mentally ill, he was also manipulative and calculating. They argued that he understood the nature and consequences of his actions and should be held fully responsible for his crimes. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Eugene Gold, argued that regardless of David's mental state, he was clearly competent to plan and execute his crimes over a period of more than a year. They pointed to the careful planning involved in his attacks, his ability to evade capture for so long, and his coherent communications with police and the media as evidence that he was not legally insane. "This defendant may be sick," prosecutor Mario Merola argued during one hearing, "but he knew exactly what he was doing when he stalked and murdered innocent people. He planned his crimes, he executed them methodically, and he tried to avoid getting caught. That's not the behavior of someone who doesn't know right from wrong." The case took an unexpected turn in April 1978, when David suddenly announced that he wanted to plead guilty to all charges. He fired his defense attorneys and told the court that he wanted to accept full responsibility for his crimes. "I am guilty," David told Judge Joseph Corso. "I committed these crimes, and I deserve to be punished. I don't want to hide behind claims of insanity anymore." David's decision to plead guilty came as a shock to everyone involved in the case. Some observers speculated that he was tired of the legal proceedings and wanted to get them over with. Others suggested that he was making a calculated decision to avoid the death penalty by showing remorse and cooperation. But those who had spent time with David had a different theory. They believed that David was still seeking attention and notoriety, and that a guilty plea would generate more media coverage than a lengthy trial. By pleading guilty, David could control the narrative of his case and ensure that he remained in the public eye. On June 12, 1978, David Berkowitz was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison for each of his 6 murders, with the sentences to run consecutively. This meant that he would serve a minimum of 150 years before becoming eligible for parole, effectively a life sentence. As he was led away to begin his prison term, David turned to the packed courtroom and spoke his final public words, "I'm sorry for what I did. I hope God forgives me." David Berkowitz was initially sent to Attica Correctional Facility, one of New York's most secure prisons. The transition from being the most feared man in New York City to being just another prisoner was jarring, but David seemed to adapt to prison life relatively quickly. In prison, David's behavior changed dramatically. The grandiose, demonic persona of the son of Sam largely disappeared, replaced by what appeared to be genuine remorse and a desire for redemption. He became a model prisoner, avoiding conflicts with other inmates and participating in various rehabilitation programs. Perhaps most significantly, David claimed to have found religion in prison. He began attending Christian services, studying the Bible, and eventually claimed to have been born again as a Christian. This conversion appeared to be genuine, as David began to speak and write about his crimes with what seemed like real remorse and understanding of the pain he had caused. "I realize now that I was not possessed by demons," David wrote in a letter to one of his victims' families in the 1980s. "I was possessed by my own hatred and selfishness. I chose to commit those terrible acts, and I alone am responsible for the pain I caused." David's apparent transformation led to numerous interviews with journalists, psychologists, and criminologists who were interested in understanding how a serial killer might change over time. In these interviews, David spoke candidly about his crimes, his motivations, and his attempts to understand what had driven him to kill. He acknowledged that his claims about demonic possession had been largely fabricated, though he maintained that he had genuinely experienced some form of mental illness during the period when he was committing his crimes. He described feeling disconnected from reality, consumed by hatred, and unable to control his violent impulses. "I was living in a fantasy world," David explained in one interview. "I created this whole mythology about Sam and the demons because it made me feel special, important. I was nobody before I became the son of Sam. Suddenly, I was famous, feared, talked about constantly. It was intoxicating." David also spoke about the specific factors that had contributed to his descent into violence. He talked about his adoption, his mother's death, his father's abandonment, and his inability to form normal relationships with women. He acknowledged that while these experiences might explain his behavior, they didn't excuse it. "Lots of people have difficult childhoods," David said. "Lots of people feel rejected and angry. But they don't go out and kill innocent people. I made a choice to become a monster, and I have to live with that choice for the rest of my life." Over the years, David has consistently refused to seek parole, stating that he believes he should remain in prison for the rest of his life. He has participated in various victim advocacy programs and has written letters of apology to the families of his victims, though not all have chosen to receive or respond to his communications. David's case has continued to fascinate criminologists, psychologists, and the general public. He represents a rare example of a serial killer who has not only survived to old age in prison but has also demonstrated what appears to be genuine remorse and personal growth. Some experts remain skeptical of David's transformation, arguing that his religious conversion and expressions of remorse are simply another form of manipulation, designed to generate sympathy and attention. Others believe that his change is genuine and represents an important case study in the possibility of rehabilitation, even for the most violent criminals. The Son of Sam case left an indelible mark on New York City and American society as a whole. For the first time, a serial killer had used the media as a tool of terror, communicating directly with the public and turning his crimes into a form of psychological warfare against an entire population. The case changed the way law enforcement approaches serial murder investigations. The massive task force assembled to catch David Berkowitz became a model for future investigations, and the psychological profiling techniques developed during the case helped establish what would later become the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. The media coverage of the Son of Sam case also set new standards for crime reporting. The extensive, sensationalized coverage was criticized by some as contributing to the panic and possibly encouraging copycat crimes, but it also demonstrated the public's fascination with understanding the minds of serial killers. For the survivors of David's attacks and the families of his victims, the impact has been lifelong. Many have struggled with physical disabilities, psychological trauma, and the constant reminder that their lives were forever changed by a few moments of senseless violence. Jodi Valenti, who survived the attack that killed her friend Donna Lauria, has spoken publicly about her experiences and the long process of healing from trauma. "You never really get over something like that," she has said. "You learn to live with it, but it's always there." Robert Violante, who was partially blinded in the attack that killed Stacy Moskowitz, eventually became an advocate for crime victims and has worked to support others who have experienced similar trauma. His strength and resilience in the face of such devastating loss has been an inspiration to many. The families of the victims have handled their grief in different ways. Some have chosen to speak publicly about their loved ones, keeping their memories alive and working to prevent similar tragedies. Others have preferred privacy, dealing with their loss away from the public eye. The case also had broader social implications. It highlighted the vulnerability of urban life and contributed to ongoing discussions about mental health, gun control, and the role of the media in covering violent crime. The Son of Sam murders occurred during a particularly difficult period in New York City's history, when the city was struggling with fiscal crisis, rising crime rates, and social unrest. Some historians and sociologists have argued that the Son of Sam case became a symbol of everything that was wrong with urban America in the 1970s, the random violence, the seeming powerlessness of authorities, and the sense that society was breaking down. The eventual capture of David Berkowitz provided a sense of closure and justice, but the fear and trauma he caused continued to resonate for years. As we reach the end of this long journey through one of America's most notorious murder cases, it's worth reflecting on what the story of David Berkowitz tells us about the nature of evil, the complexity of human psychology, and our society's ongoing struggle to understand and prevent such tragedies. David Berkowitz was not born a monster. He was a troubled child who became a disturbed adolescent and eventually a serial killer, but at each stage of his development, there were opportunities for intervention that might have changed the trajectory of his life. His adoption trauma, his mother's death, his father's abandonment, his social isolation, all of these factors contributed to his eventual descent into violence, but none of them made that descent inevitable. What makes David's case particularly troubling is how ordinary he appeared to those around him. His neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances saw him as quiet, perhaps a little strange, but not dangerous. This ordinariness is perhaps the most frightening aspect of his story, the reminder that evil can hide behind the most mundane facades. The Son of Sam case also illustrates the complex relationship between mental illness and criminal responsibility. David clearly suffered from psychological problems, but the extent to which those problems excused his behavior remains a matter of debate. His apparent transformation in prison suggests that with proper treatment and genuine remorse, even the most violent individuals might be capable of change, though this doesn't diminish the terrible price paid by his victims and their families. Perhaps most importantly, the case reminds us of the value of every human life that was lost or forever changed by David's actions. Donna Lauria, who dreamed of becoming a nurse. Christine Freund, who was planning her future with her boyfriend. Virginia Voskerikian, who was walking home from college classes. Alexander Esau and Valentina Suriani, young lovers with their whole lives ahead of them. Stacy Moskowitz, who had just started her career. These were not just statistics or names in newspaper headlines. They were real people with families, friends, dreams, and futures that were cut short by senseless violence. The survivors, Jodi Valenti, Carl Denaro, Rosemary Keenan, Joanne Lomino, Sal Lupo, Judy Placido, and Robert Violante, have shown remarkable courage in rebuilding their lives and speaking out about their experiences. The story of the Son of Sam is ultimately a reminder of both the capacity for evil that exists within human nature and the resilience of those who survive such evil. It's a story about how one person's descent into madness can terrorize an entire city, but also about how a community can come together in the face of terror and eventually find justice and healing. As David Berkowitz continues to serve his life sentence, now in his 70s, he remains a subject of study for criminologists and psychologists trying to understand what creates a killer and whether such individuals can truly change. His case continues to inform law enforcement techniques, victim advocacy programs, and our broader understanding of criminal psychology. But perhaps the most important lesson from this dark chapter in New York City's history is the need for vigilance, not just against external threats, but against the conditions that can create such threats. Mental health support, intervention programs for troubled youth, strong communities that don't let individuals fall through the cracks, these are the tools we have to prevent future tragedies. The summer of terror that gripped New York City in 1976 and 1977 is now more than 40 years in the past, but its lessons remain relevant today. In a world that still struggles with random violence, mental illness, and social isolation, the story of David Berkowitz serves as both a cautionary tale and a call to action. As dawn broke over New York City on August 11, 1977, the day after David Berkowitz's arrest, something had fundamentally changed. The fear that had gripped the city for over a year began to lift, replaced by a collective sigh of relief and a slow return to normalcy. Young couples began to venture out at night again. Women with long, dark hair stopped dyeing it blonde or cutting it short. The outer boroughs, which had seen their nightlife nearly disappear during the height of the terror, began to come back to life. But the scars remained. The families of the victims continued to grieve. The survivors continued to heal, both physically and emotionally. The city itself had been changed by the experience, made more aware of its vulnerabilities but also more conscious of its strength and resilience. Today, David Berkowitz remains in prison, an elderly man serving multiple life sentences for crimes committed when he was young. He has become a case study in criminal psychology, a cautionary tale about the dangers of untreated mental illness and social isolation, and a reminder of the terrible price that society pays when such conditions go unaddressed. The Son of Sam case has entered the realm of true crime legend, the subject of countless books, documentaries, and films. But beyond the sensationalism and the fascination with the psychology of a killer, the case remains at its heart a human tragedy, a story of lives lost, families destroyed, and a community terrorized by one person's descent into madness. As we close this long journey through one of America's most notorious criminal cases, let us remember not just the killer, but the killed. Not just the terror, but the courage of those who survived it. Not just the darkness of human nature, but the light of those who work to prevent such darkness from spreading. The story of the Son of Sam is over, but the lessons it teaches us about vigilance, compassion, and the need to care for the most vulnerable members of our society remain as relevant today as they were in that terrifying summer of 1977. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe, so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. In the quiet town of Delphi, Indiana, where cornfields stretch toward endless horizons and the pace of life moves like honey on a cold morning, February 13, 2017 began like any other winter day. The air was crisp, carrying that particular stillness that comes with late winter afternoons. It was President's Day, and many students had the day off from school, a perfect opportunity for adventure in a town where excitement was often something you had to create for yourself. 13-year-old Abigail Joyce Williams, Abby to everyone who knew her, was the kind of girl who brought energy into every room she entered. Born on June 23, 2003, she possessed that infectious enthusiasm that only comes with being 13 and seeing the world as full of endless possibilities. Her best friend, 14-year-old Liberty Rose Lynn German, known affectionately as Libby, was born on December 27, 2002, and complemented Abby perfectly. Where Abby was exuberant, Libby was thoughtful. Where Abby was impulsive, Libby was cautious. Together, they formed one of those friendships that seemed destined to last a lifetime. On this particular Monday afternoon, the girls had made plans that seemed perfectly ordinary for two teenagers in small-town Indiana. They wanted to explore the Monon High Bridge Trail, a popular hiking spot just outside of town. The trail was part of the old Monon Railroad line that once connected Chicago to Indianapolis, carrying passengers and freight through the heart of America. The railroad had long since been abandoned, but the massive steel trestle bridge remained, converted into part of a walking trail that offered stunning views of Deer Creek Valley below. The Monon High Bridge itself was an impressive structure, spanning 853 feet across the valley at a height of 63 feet above the creek. It was the kind of place where local teenagers often came to test their courage, walking across the railroad ties while trying not to look down through the gaps to the water far below. The bridge had an almost magnetic pull for young people in Delphi, representing both beauty and danger, adventure and risk. Libby's older sister, Kelsey, had agreed to drop the girls off at the trailhead that afternoon. As they prepared to leave, Libby did something that would prove to be both fortunate and haunting. She made sure her phone was fully charged. At 14, she was responsible for her age, always thinking ahead. This simple act of preparation would later provide investigators with the most crucial evidence in what would become one of Indiana's most high-profile murder cases. The drive to the trail was filled with the kind of casual conversation that marks ordinary moments: talk about school, friends, plans for the upcoming week. Kelsey dropped them off at the trail entrance around 1:30 in the afternoon, with plans to pick them up later. The girls walked into the February afternoon with the casual confidence of young people who had explored these woods countless times before. None of them could have imagined that this would be the last time Abby and Libby would be seen alive. The Monon High Bridge Trail was moderately busy that day, despite the chilly February weather. Several other people were out enjoying the trail: dog walkers, hikers, others simply looking to escape the cabin fever that comes with Indiana winters. Among these individuals was a man who would later become central to the investigation, though at the time, he seemed like just another person enjoying the outdoors. What happened next can only be pieced together through fragments of evidence, witness accounts, and the heart-wrenching final moments captured on Libby German's phone. As the girls made their way along the trail toward the bridge, they encountered other hikers. They took pictures, enjoying the winter scenery and each other's company. The creek below was partially frozen, creating the kind of stark, beautiful landscape that defines Indiana winters. It was sometime around 2:30 in the afternoon when the girls reached the Monon High Bridge itself. The massive steel structure stretched before them, its railroad ties creating a rhythmic pattern that led across the valley. For many people, crossing the bridge was an intimidating prospect. The gaps between the ties were wide enough to see straight down to the creek below, and there were no handrails or safety barriers of any kind. But for Abby and Libby, the bridge held no particular fear. They had been here before, and they approached it with the kind of casual bravery that comes naturally to teenagers. They began walking across, taking pictures and videos as they went. The wind was picking up, and the afternoon was beginning to take on that particular quality that comes just before sunset, even though darkness was still hours away. It was during this time on the bridge that something changed. Libby, ever the responsible one, was using her phone to document their adventure. She was taking pictures and brief video clips, the kind of casual documentation that has become second nature to teenagers in the smartphone age. But at some point, her use of the phone shifted from casual documentation to something far more serious. Investigators would later determine that around 2:07 p.m., Libby began recording video on her phone. What she captured in those final moments would haunt investigators and the public for years to come. The video showed a figure approaching the girls from behind, a man walking across the bridge toward them. He was dressed in dark clothing, wearing what appeared to be a dark jacket and jeans, with his hands in his pockets and a distinctive walk. As the man got closer, something about his presence clearly alarmed Libby enough that she continued recording, keeping her phone active even as the situation began to deteriorate. The figure in the video became known to millions of people across the country as Bridge Guy, a grainy, distant image that would become one of the most recognized pieces of evidence in modern true crime. The video Libby captured was brief but chilling. In the final moments of the recording, a male voice can be heard saying words that would echo through the investigation for years: "Guys, down the hill." The voice was calm but commanding, carrying an undertone of authority that suggested this was not a request but a demand. These 4 words, captured in Libby's final act of courage and presence of mind, would become the most important clue in the case. What happened next occurred away from the bridge, away from the possibility of other witnesses, in the wooded area below where the girls were apparently forced to go. The details of their final hours remain largely private out of respect for their families, but investigators would later reveal that both girls died from injuries to their necks. Their bodies were discovered the following day, February 14, in a wooded area near Deer Creek, about half a mile from the bridge. The discovery of the girls' bodies launched one of the most intensive investigations in Indiana history. The Indiana State Police, Carroll County Sheriff's Department, and FBI immediately mobilized massive resources to solve the case. Within days, investigators had released the images and audio from Libby's phone to the public, hoping someone would recognize the man who had become known as Bridge Guy. The response was overwhelming. Tips poured in from across the country as the case gained national attention. The image of Bridge Guy was shared millions of times on social media, and the audio of his voice was played on news programs from coast to coast. Everyone seemed certain that someone, somewhere, would recognize the man and the case would be solved quickly. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, the investigation began to take on the frustrating rhythm that characterizes many complex criminal cases. Despite thousands of tips and hundreds of interviews, investigators seemed no closer to identifying their suspect. The man in the video remained a phantom, and the case began to take on the characteristics of a cold case, even though it remained very much active. In July 2017, about 5 months after the murders, investigators released a composite sketch of their suspect based on witness descriptions. The sketch showed a man who appeared to be middle-aged, with a mustache and a weathered face. The image was distributed widely, but like the video and audio before it, it failed to generate the breakthrough investigators were hoping for. The investigation continued at a steady pace, but without the urgency of those first few months. Investigators followed thousands of leads, interviewed hundreds of people, and pursued every possible avenue they could think of. They consulted with behavioral analysts, forensic experts, and other specialists. They used advanced technology to enhance the video and audio evidence. But the identity of Bridge Guy remained elusive. As the first anniversary of the murders approached, the case had become a source of both frustration and determination for everyone involved. The families of Abby and Libby had become advocates for the investigation, working tirelessly to keep the case in the public eye. They organized vigils, spoke to media outlets, and maintained a constant presence on social media, always hoping that the next tip, the next lead, would be the one that broke the case open. In April 2019, more than 2 years after the murders, investigators made an announcement that surprised many people who had been following the case. They released a new composite sketch of their suspect, one that looked dramatically different from the first. This new sketch showed a much younger man, clean-shaven, with a more modern appearance. Even more significantly, investigators announced that they believed the perpetrator was likely someone from the local area or someone with strong connections to Delphi. Along with the new sketch, investigators also released additional audio from Libby's phone. The longer clip included more of the suspect's voice, giving people a better sense of how he sounded. The hope was that someone who knew him would recognize not just his appearance, but his voice as well. The release of the new information generated renewed interest in the case, but still no arrest. The investigation continued its methodical pace, with investigators pursuing every lead and following every possible connection. They expanded their use of genetic genealogy, hoping to develop DNA evidence that could lead them to their suspect. They continued to interview people and re-interview others, always hoping for that crucial detail that would finally crack the case. What the public didn't know was that investigators had actually spoken to their future suspect very early in the investigation. Richard Matthew Allen, a 50-year-old Delphi resident who worked at the local CVS pharmacy, had contacted police shortly after the murders to report that he had been on the trail that day. In a brief interview, Allen told investigators that he had been on the bridge around 1:30 p.m., before the girls arrived, and had seen several people during his walk. Allen's information was documented and filed away with thousands of other tips and interviews. At the time, he seemed like just another helpful citizen providing information about who else might have been in the area. The fact that he had been on the trail that day was noted, but investigators had no reason to consider him a suspect. His timeline seemed to place him on the trail before the girls even arrived, and he appeared to be cooperating fully with the investigation. For more than 5 years, Allen continued to live his quiet life in Delphi. He worked at the CVS pharmacy, where he was known as a helpful and courteous employee. He lived with his wife in a modest home, and by all outward appearances, he seemed like any other middle-aged resident of small-town Indiana. He had no significant criminal history, no obvious connection to the victims, and nothing about his behavior seemed to draw suspicion. But sometimes the most important breakthroughs in criminal investigations come not from dramatic discoveries or high-tech analysis, but from simple administrative work. In September 2022, more than 5 years after the murders, a volunteer helping to organize the massive file of tips and evidence in the case noticed something significant. The volunteer was going through old interviews and tips, trying to help investigators organize the thousands of documents that had accumulated over the years. In reviewing Allen's 2017 interview, the volunteer noticed something that previous investigators had apparently missed or not fully considered. Allen had told police that he was on the trail that day around the same time that other witnesses had reported seeing a man matching the description of Bridge Guy. When investigators looked more closely at the timeline Allen had provided, they realized it didn't quite match what he had originally told them. This discrepancy prompted investigators to take a much closer look at Richard Allen. They began conducting surveillance and gathering more information about his background and movements. What they discovered was intriguing enough to justify obtaining a search warrant for his home and property. On October 13, 2022, investigators executed a search warrant at Allen's Delphi home. They seized various items of evidence, including firearms, electronic devices, and clothing. Among the items taken was a .40 caliber Sig Sauer pistol that Allen owned. The search represented the most significant development in the case since the murders themselves. On October 26, 2022, Richard Allen was arrested and charged with 2 counts of murder in the deaths of Abby Williams and Libby German. The arrest sent shockwaves through Delphi and the true crime community that had followed the case so closely for so many years. After more than 5 years of investigation, police finally had their suspect. The evidence against Allen was both circumstantial and, in some ways, compelling. The most significant physical evidence was an unspent .40 caliber bullet found at the crime scene near the girls' bodies. Forensic analysis suggested that this bullet had been cycled through Allen's Sig Sauer pistol, meaning it had been loaded into the chamber and then ejected without being fired. This type of evidence, known as tool mark analysis, suggested that Allen's gun had been at the crime scene. Beyond the physical evidence, investigators pointed to Allen's changing story about his activities on the day of the murders. While he had initially told police he was on the trail earlier in the day, further investigation suggested he may have been there at the same time as the girls. Witnesses who had seen a man matching the Bridge Guy description had placed him on the trail around the same time that Abby and Libby were there. The case against Allen was also built on what investigators described as incriminating statements he made while in custody. According to prosecutors, Allen made several confessions while in jail awaiting trial, including detailed admissions about his involvement in the murders. These statements, made during phone calls with his wife and in conversations with correctional staff, became a crucial part of the prosecution's case. However, Allen's defense team argued that their client's mental state had deteriorated significantly while in custody, and that any statements he made were the product of psychological distress rather than genuine admissions of guilt. They pointed out that Allen had maintained his innocence for years, and that his alleged confessions only came after months in isolation in jail. The defense also challenged the reliability of the tool mark analysis on the bullet, arguing that this type of evidence was not conclusive enough to prove that Allen's specific gun had been at the crime scene. They suggested that the bullet could have been connected to any number of similar firearms, and that the forensic analysis was not as definitive as prosecutors claimed. The trial of Richard Allen began in October 2024, more than 7 years after the murders that had captivated the nation. The proceedings were held in Carroll County, with intense media attention and security measures reflecting the high-profile nature of the case. Families of the victims, members of the community, and true crime enthusiasts from across the country followed every development in the courtroom. During the trial, prosecutors presented their evidence methodically. They walked jurors through the timeline of events on February 13, 2017, using Libby German's phone evidence to establish what had happened on the bridge that day. They played the audio recording of "Guys, Down the Hill" and showed the video of Bridge Guy walking across the bridge toward the girls. The prosecution's case relied heavily on the combination of physical evidence, circumstantial evidence, and Allen's alleged confessions. They argued that the unspent bullet found at the scene had been cycled through Allen's gun, placing him at the location where the girls were killed. They presented evidence of Allen's changing stories about his activities that day, and they played recordings of his alleged confessions made while in jail. Perhaps most dramatically, prosecutors revealed that they had additional video evidence from Libby's phone that had never been released to the public. This fuller video showed more of the encounter between the girls and their killer, providing additional context for the audio that had become so famous. While the additional footage didn't clearly identify the perpetrator's face, it provided more evidence about what had happened in those final moments. The defense, led by attorneys Bradley Rozzi and Andrew Baldwin, mounted an aggressive challenge to the prosecution's case. They argued that their client had been the victim of a rushed investigation that focused on him only because he had voluntarily come forward as a witness. They suggested that investigators, under pressure to solve the high-profile case, had zeroed in on Allen without adequately considering other suspects. Central to the defense strategy was challenging Allen's mental state during the time he allegedly made confessions. They presented evidence that Allen had experienced significant psychological distress while in custody, including what they described as psychotic episodes. They argued that any statements he made during this period were not reliable indicators of his actual involvement in the crimes. The defense also brought in their own forensic experts to challenge the tool mark analysis on the bullet. They argued that this type of evidence was inherently unreliable, and that it was impossible to conclusively determine that the bullet found at the scene had been cycled through Allen's specific gun. They suggested that similar conclusions could be reached with thousands of similar firearms. Throughout the trial, both sides grappled with the central challenge that had defined the case from the beginning. Despite years of investigation and significant evidence, there was still no definitive proof linking Allen to the scene at the time of the murders. The case remained largely circumstantial, requiring jurors to piece together various elements of evidence to reach a conclusion about Allen's guilt or innocence. The families of Abby Williams and Libby German were present throughout the trial, demonstrating the strength and dignity they had shown throughout the long investigation. Their presence served as a constant reminder of what was at stake, not just the question of Richard Allen's guilt or innocence, but the pursuit of justice for two young girls whose lives had been cut tragically short. After hearing weeks of testimony and examining hundreds of pieces of evidence, the jury began their deliberations in November 2024. The deliberation process took approximately 19 hours over 3 days, reflecting the complexity of the evidence and the gravity of the decision they were being asked to make. On November 11, 2024, the jury returned with their verdict. Richard Allen was found guilty on all 4 counts against him: 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of murder while committing or attempting to commit kidnapping. The verdict brought to a close the longest and most intensive criminal investigation in Carroll County history. The conviction was met with relief and satisfaction from the families of the victims, who had waited more than 7 years for this moment. However, it was also accompanied by the recognition that no verdict could truly restore what had been lost or heal the wounds left by such a senseless tragedy. On December 20, 2024, Richard Allen was sentenced to 130 years in prison, 65 years for each murder count, to be served consecutively. Judge Francis Gull imposed the maximum sentence allowed under Indiana law, ensuring that Allen would spend the rest of his life behind bars. At 52 years old, the sentence effectively meant that Allen would never again be a free man. During the sentencing hearing, family members of both victims had the opportunity to address Allen directly. Their statements were powerful and emotional, describing not only their grief and loss, but also their strength and determination to ensure that Abby and Libby were remembered for who they were, not just how they died. The resolution of the case brought a measure of closure to the Delphi community, which had lived with the shadow of the unsolved murders for so many years. The case had affected everyone in the small town, creating an atmosphere of caution and concern that had persisted throughout the investigation. While the conviction couldn't erase what had happened, it did provide a sense that justice had been served. However, the case of the Delphi murders continues to generate discussion and debate, even after Allen's conviction. His defense team has announced plans to appeal the verdict, arguing that errors in the trial process may have affected the outcome. They continue to maintain their client's innocence and express confidence that the conviction will be overturned on appeal. The case also continues to raise questions about the investigation process and the challenges of solving complex criminal cases. The fact that Allen was interviewed early in the investigation but not identified as a suspect for more than 5 years highlights both the difficulties investigators face in managing massive amounts of information and the importance of systematic review of evidence. Perhaps most significantly, the case demonstrates the crucial role that Libby German's presence of mind played in ultimately solving the crime. Her decision to record video and audio during the encounter with her killer provided the most important evidence in the case. Without her quick thinking and courage in those final moments, it's possible that the case might never have been solved. The story of the Delphi murders is ultimately one of tragedy and loss, but also of courage, determination, and the pursuit of justice. 2 young girls lost their lives in the most senseless way possible, but their memory has been honored by the tireless work of investigators, the strength of their families, and the support of a community that refused to forget them. As we reflect on this case, we're reminded of both the darkness that can exist in the world and the light that can emerge from even the most difficult circumstances. Abby Williams and Libby German were taken far too young, but their story serves as a testament to the importance of never giving up in the pursuit of justice, no matter how long it takes. The Monon High Bridge still stands in Delphi, Indiana, now serving as an unofficial memorial to 2 girls whose friendship, courage, and memory will not be forgotten. The case that captivated a nation for more than 7 years has finally reached its conclusion in the courtrooms of Carroll County, but the impact of their story will continue to resonate for years to come. In the end, the Delphi murders case reminds us that justice, while sometimes delayed, can still prevail. It shows us the importance of community, the dedication of law enforcement, and the power of never giving up hope. Most importantly, it honors the memory of Abby Williams and Libby German, 2 young girls whose lives, though cut short, made a lasting impact on everyone who heard their story. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully, knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.